After the smash hit that was Sonic the Hedgehog, it was inevitable that a sequel would go into development. And while Sonic was an incredible feat, perhaps single-handedly changing the fate of the Sega Genesis, for many, myself included, Sonic 2 would be an improvement over the original. So let's talk about what game design decisions were made that would make Sonic 2 into the success that it was. For those who haven't seen it, I covered Sonic 1 in a previous video, so I won't be retreading over mechanics I already discussed unless there was some major change up for Sonic 2. I also like to start these videos with a brief bit of development history before really diving into the game design. With that note, time to talk about Sonic 2. After Sonic 1 completed, despite its incredible success, there was a rift between the Sonic team and Sega. Yuji Naka, the programmer behind Sonic and a man with the initial idea for Sonic, felt like Sega's management weren't supportive enough and didn't pay him enough, so he left Sega. Meanwhile, Hirokazu Yasuhara, who had been the main game designer on Sonic 1, left for a new venture, STI or Sega Technical Institute. This was a company based in the US, founded by Mark Cerny, to not only have Japanese and American developers collaborate, but let Japanese developers train up the Americans. So the only main Sonic team member left with Sega of Japan was artist Naoto Oshima, who had come up with the visual design of Sonic and created the art for Sonic 1. While Hirokazu Yasuhara had become the main game designer, to my understanding, it sounds like Yuji Naka and Naoto Oshima were also highly involved in the game design, with each one having a unique perspective on what would make Sonic a good game. While the team was fractured, Mark Cerny visited Japan and was shocked to learn Yuji Naka had left Sega. He convinced Yuji Naka to join him at STI, reuniting Yuji Naka and Hirokazu Yasuhara. They didn't have a specific project planned, so Yuji Naka got to work on figuring out how to create multiplayer, as he found multiplayer games more fun than single-player games. As their first pitch to Sega of America, STI pitched Sonic 2 for the 1992 holiday season, giving the team 11 months of development time, which would seem like a no-brainer, but shockingly, Sega of America wasn't entirely sure. A couple months later, they decided yes on Sonic 2, and that they wanted it completed for the 1992 holiday season, dropping the development time to only 9 months. While the game hadn't been fully in development, as Sega of America hadn't greenlit it yet, the team had started to work on ideas for the initial pitch, and this lack of time did have some ripple effects. For example, Hirokazu Yasuhara initially wanted Sonic 2 to be about time travel. In this concept, he had a map that he described as being somewhat similar to Mario 3, where players would be able to travel to different zones and even different time periods. Relics of this idea still exist, with Hilltop Zone and the dinosaurs of it initially being intended as the past version of Green Hill Zone. Ironically, back in Japan, Naoto Oshima would be tasked with creating an entirely different sequel to Sonic in Sonic CD. Sonic CD would end up heavily featuring time travel, with Back to the Future serving as its inspiration. However, according to Hirokazu Yasuhara, he didn't have any contact with Naoto Oshima at the time, and neither were aware of each other's time travel vision. Either way, because of the development schedule change, Hirokazu Yasuhara states that the idea was too ambitious for an 8-month development cycle, and the story was rewritten while the levels were trimmed off. According to Wikipedia, the book Playing at the Next Level, A History of American Sega Games by Ken Horowitz states that there was rising tension between the American and Japanese developers. According to Wikipedia, Retro Gamer's article The Making of Sonic the Hedgehog 2 has a quote from level artist Craig Stitt that Hirokazu Yasuhara was pleasant to work with, but Yuji Naka apparently was, quote, an arrogant pain in the ass. That said, I don't own either of these and can't 100% confirm the information there. To my understanding, it's also hearsay from one member who may have specifically been dissatisfied with his working relationship with Yuji Naka. Either way, what resulted was an absolute banger of a game with Sonic 2. The development history of Sonic 2 is fascinating, and if you are interested in learning more, I highly recommend the video, The Making of Sonic the Hedgehog 2 by Stray Fox. Stray Fox has consistently made high-quality video game documentaries for over a decade, so if you haven't seen their content, it's worth a watch. There's also a fantastic video on the subject by GameFAQs Special called The Definitive Development History of Sonic the Hedgehog 2, which I'll link to in the description. Boot up Sonic 2, and players will immediately be introduced to one of the major new factors of Sonic 2, Miles Tails Prower. In fact, Sonic and Tails now even get a little intro tag prior to the title screen. Beyond Tails, for the most part, the Sonic 2 title is similar to the first game's title. Sonic and Tails will both pop out and pose as part of a title emblem while the background moves behind them. However, there are a few small details you might notice here. For one, Sonic is slimmer in Sonic 2 than in Sonic 1, or at least his head seems a little smaller in proportion to his body. On top of that, his spikes protrude more back, whereas in Sonic 1, they come up a little bit more. His eyes also look a little more angled to me and slightly less round. In totality, it all makes Sonic look a little more sleek and less cutesy to my eye. On top of that, the color of his fur is a deeper, darker blue. This also carries over to his sprite when you play the game. I'm not sure what the reason for this color shift was, but I do personally find the color more appealing, so I don't mind. On top of that, there's a lot less going on in the background. Sonic 1's title screen felt like it was moving at a brisk pace thanks to the large number of parallax layers being shown off in motion. While that does work as a nice graphical showcase, it does also make the title screen feel fairly busy. Sonic 2 instead seems to favor simplicity and removing a bit of that busyness. Instead, we get a single island in the background, and I believe only one animated background image that's slowly moving across the screen. A shooting star does cut across the screen, but still, it has far less motion than Sonic 1. While I appreciate the parallax of Sonic 1 and think it looks really cool, I do think I prefer the simplicity of Sonic 2's title screen. But that's totally subjective, and I do wonder what your preference might be. Beyond the visuals, there is one other notable change to the Sonic 2 title screen, and that's that players now have the option to play a 2-player versus mode, but that's something I'll touch on later on in the video. Press start, and players will enter Emerald Hill Zone, Sonic 2's version of Green Hill Zone. But before jumping into Emerald Hill Zone, there are some major mechanic shifts from Sonic 1 that I want to go over, as they're all going to have a pretty heavy effect on the overall gameplay of Sonic 2. For the most part, to my understanding, most of the basic mechanics were left untouched, so if you want a detailed breakdown of things like how Sonic's acceleration works, ramps, or the ring system, I'll redirect you to my Sonic 1 analysis video, as there's no reason for me to say everything I'd already said. However, one of the most striking new things players will immediately notice is that, as shown in the title screen, Sonic isn't alone, but is now joined by Miles Tails Prower, with Miles Prower being a play on miles per hour. Tails was introduced to Sonic primarily for the purpose of adding multiplayer. To my understanding, this was thanks to Hirokazu Yasuhara, who wanted Sonic 2 to have a way that siblings could play together. Similar to how Sonic came about from an internal contest at Sega, the team held an internal contest for Sonic's sidekick, and it was Yasushi Yamaguchi's design for Tails that would win out. According to Yasushi Yamaguchi, or Judy Toyota, it was Yuji Naka who came up with the idea of Tails being a 1.5-like player character who even beginners could play as. This all led to Tails becoming an incredibly unique character, and one I don't think I'd really seen before in other platform games. For all intents and purposes, Tails has no health. He also doesn't control what happens in the game at all. The camera moves with Sonic, not with Tails. The level finishes with Sonic, not with Tails. What Tails can do is collect coins for Sonic, destroy enemies for Sonic, and activate platforms. I thought Tails could fly, but I guess I Mandela affected myself into thinking that. Tails can fly and latch onto Sonic to greater heights, but this was only added in Sonic 3 and then retroactively added to certain remakes of Sonic 2. Even if players are playing solo, Tails will still be there trailing behind Sonic, helping out by sometimes gathering rings Sonic missed, or attacking enemies /Robotnik for Sonic, or allowing a second player to come in and join at any time. It's a pretty cool idea in that way. Player 2 can hop in when they want and leave when they want, and that doesn't affect the totality of if player 1 can continue to play the game or not. As unique as this idea is, Tails comes with a plethora of pros and cons, both in single player mode and multiplayer mode, so let's go over all of it. In single player mode, Tails can be both a savior and an absolute horrible hindrance. The programming for Tails is interesting. For the most part, Tails will trail behind Sonic and almost entirely mimic what Sonic is doing. If Sonic progresses too fast, Tails can get left behind off-screen, and at a certain distance will respawn and fly back in to once again trail Sonic. For the most part, Tails functions like a replica of Sonic, and I would surmise was programmed in exactly that way. He probably has the same triggers and simple colliders, although they're different heights, so maybe Tails has a smaller hitbox around him. That means, like Sonic, he functions the same way for touching the ground, hitting enemies, getting hit, bouncing off of objects, or even activating certain platforms if he lands on them. This makes sense, as he really is a reskinned Sonic that player 2 can play as, or a single player if they find the secret way to do so, which I don't think I ever knew about as a kid, so this was honestly news to me. There is one notable exception to Tails mimicking everything Sonic can do, in that Tails can't destroy item monitors. I'm not sure why this specifically was disabled, but maybe it has to do with the shield power-up, and the team thinking it would be odd if player 2 gained the power-up for Sonic. Either that, or they didn't want the computer destroying an item box, as it's supposed to feel like fun and like a reward to get, and perhaps they felt it would diminish the feeling of excitement for players destroying the item monitors themselves. For the most part, it visually seems like Tails is copying anything Sonic does, and while that is mostly true, leave it to sonicretro.org to have a fantastic breakdown of exactly how the player 2's CPU works. Apparently, the game keeps track of player 1's state 16 frames in the past with the following info. What position is Sonic facing? What state is Sonic in during that frame? Is it a pushing state, movement state, jumping state, etc.? What is the XY position of Sonic? What is the controller input? Really, the main thing to consider is that because Tails is behind Sonic, something Sonic has done won't always necessarily be true for Tails, meaning Tails might end up in a different spot. For example, if Sonic destroys and bounces off of an enemy and Tails is behind Sonic, Tails would then fall through where the enemy is. The computer now needs to adjust where Tails is in a natural way to once again start following Sonic. What if something has led the CPU to get stuck on a ramp where Sonic would have been running, but that's not enough speed for Tails to make it? The computer checks a number of factors, and if it's determined Tails is stuck like this, Tails will perform a spin dash even though Sonic hasn't. These are the little details that I imagine most players probably don't think too much about and take for granted, but it's a lot of clever programming to give Tails the feeling that he's following Sonic at all times, even though there are so many obstacles that can prevent the computer from doing this. But just like how Sonic, and therefore the player, can accidentally screw over Tails and strand Tails without thinking about it, Tails can also screw over Sonic. So this is where it becomes a bit of a back and forth for if having Tails is truly a good thing. Tails does collect rings for Sonic. While this can be useful while the player is running around, it's especially useful after a player gets hit and their ring starts spilling out, as the computer Tails acts like an extra safety to potentially collect back some of those rings that prevent Sonic from actually dying. Tails can also destroy enemies for Sonic, and more notably, hurt Robotnik. For some of the more tricky Robotnik boss battles, that means players can sometimes get a hit in on Robotnik, even if they themselves messed up and were injured, because Tails will be the one to actually land the hit. That can all be super cool. But there is a downside, as really, Sonic 2 is still designed as a one-player game. While Tails can injure bosses and enemies, that also comes with its own issues. For example, let's say Tails hits Robotnik when you're least expecting it, activating his iframes, which means Sonic will fly through Robotnik instead of bouncing off. This could mean players end up flying into lava when they least expect it, like in the case of the Scorcher Mark II from Hilltop Zone. This could cause both a loss of rings or even a death. In the worst case scenario, in a stage like Chemical Plant Zone, where Robotnik is regularly over an instant death water trap, Tails could activate those iframes before Sonic hits Robotnik and cause players to fly through to their immediate doom. This can also happen with enemies, although the likelihood of that is a little more rare, and I honestly don't have footage of this happening to me, but you know, it's something I'm sure is a possible scenario. Not only can Tails activate iframes at the worst of times, Tails can also activate platforms, like this one in Hilltop Zone Act 1, which I didn't register until it was too late that Tails activated a lift before I'd hopped on, and I then stepped off to an immediate death. Not a big deal when you have 16 lives, but it can definitely be a big deal when you're new to the game and struggling, as it can certainly feel cheap and like an unfair death. I'm not entirely sure how much of this was completely thought through, and how much was an unintended side effect of having this second character, but in a funny way, it kind of balances out Tails potentially making the game easier. Tails helps get quick extra hits in on Robotnik, but then adds a new extra risk of players dying or getting injured. Tails can collect rings for players, but can activate platforms that unintentionally kill the player. The added risk/reward with bosses is a nice balance, but I do think Tails unintentionally activating platforms is a problem, and the team probably should have made it so Tails could only activate platforms if player 2 is controlling the character. While I always play Sonic 2 with Tails as it feels like the default, when I think about it, I probably prefer the precision of playing with Sonic alone. I like mistakes to be my own and not ones that feel added by the AI. Granted, you can read and predict Tails, although Tails definitely feels like a boon in the new special stages that I'll be going over. But Tails is a fun addition to the game, even with the added mayhem. I do think it would have been nice if the option to play as Sonic or Tails solo weren't so tucked away in Sonic 2, and think Sonic 3 handled this choice much better, with the choice being front and center whenever players choose their save. Really though, the most interesting aspect to Tails is in how he handles for multiplayer. If at any point a second player starts using the second controller, AI control over Tails is turned off. This timer lasts for 10 seconds each time the second player puts in an input. Nothing about Tails changes outside of the fact that a player now has control over him. He can still collect rings, destroy enemies, hurt Robotnik, is impervious to truly dying, and has no control over the camera. The idea that Yuji Naka and Hirokazu Yasuhara had was based around siblings playing the game and Tails acting as an easy mode for newcomers. To that end, it certainly works. As the second player doesn't have to worry about death, they don't have to be particularly good at the game. Also, with the fact that Sonic and Player 1 are always in control of the camera, it wouldn't be fair for Player 2 anyways, as it's so easy for a player to leave Tails in the dust, accidentally or not. Player 2 can still feel important, as they can run ahead and take out difficult enemies, collect rings for Sonic to help prevent Player 1 from dying, and especially help out against bosses, acting as the offense while Player 1 hides away if they so choose. That said, I imagine this is only really fun for someone new at video games, or someone young. With Sonic and Player 1 fully in control of the camera, and as this is a fast-moving game, that means there will be a large number of times Tails is completely left out from playing the game. I mean, just think about areas like the start of Chemical Plant Zone. There is no way Tails is keeping up unless the two players really specifically stop and coordinate this. It's been a long time since I played Sonic 2 with the multiplayer, and I do remember playing with my brothers and having fun getting to play together. But I also think I was usually Player 1, and it's probably not all that fun as Player 2. So I decided for this video to play the game with my wife and try playing both as Player 1 and Player 2. And like I thought, playing as Tails is just okay. You don't really feel like you can do very much, as Player 1 so quickly and often leaves you in the dust. I like that I could occasionally help out my wife when I was playing as Tails, so to that end, it felt like I was there every so often to assist her, and it worked in that regard, but it felt more like watching her play. My wife, for her part, described the experience as a 1.5 player game. It was her first time ever playing Sonic 2, and still, she wasn't super impressed with the fact she consistently couldn't see her character. She did like the boss fights because she felt more involved, But otherwise, she found the experience to be pretty mediocre and thought there were better two-player games out there. Multiplayer in 2D action platform games is an interesting topic to me because it's so incredibly hard to get it right, and I don't think there's any perfect solution, at least not one that I think I've seen. The original Super Mario Bros. Probably has the simplest way to handle this. Players 1 and 2 take turns, with the other player having a chance to play when the current player dies. It's more competitive, as the players don't help each other progress. Mario 3 does a better job by making it so players progress together, and not only will dying switch whose turn it is, but also completing a stage. This solution is great in that it allows the game to be fully designed as a single-player experience, but the counter is that one player will always be watching the other. You're not really ever playing together, and technically, you could do the same thing just passing the controller back and forth in single-player mode. So, Sonic 2 then has a solution that allows the players to actually play together. But with two players on screen at once, there will always be the issue of the camera, as well as platform challenges. Who do you follow with the camera? And what if you have a very specific set of platform challenges where the sequence is timed and the platforms are timed for one player handling the situation? Those types of platform challenges are incredibly rare in Sonic, so the team didn't have to worry about that too much, but the camera was an issue, and that's where the team decided to only have it follow Sonic, to the detriment of Player 2. So yes, you are playing at the same time, but Player 2's experience is going to be worse than Player 1's. Future titles have experimented with other ideas, and I still don't think anything has perfected it. Donkey Kong Country took the approach of trying to make the single player feel more like multiplayer. To do this, the game has both characters on screen at once, so long as they're alive. Players can then switch who's playing mid-level, and each character has something specific that makes them special compared to the other. On top of that, if one character dies, the level doesn't end, but the other player immediately begins playing, making the whole thing feel more like teamwork. While it's still single player and watching the other player play the game, that teamwork aspect makes it feel more like multiplayer. This has probably been my personal favorite approach, but let's look at some other examples. Donkey Kong Country Returns instead puts both players on screen playing at the same time. The camera follows whoever has made the most forward progress, meaning backtracking for secrets takes a little coordination. Although, because the game isn't as fast-paced as something like Sonic, that isn't as difficult to do. The camera is also much more zoomed out, so you can see more, which has also helped thanks to the 16:9 screen of modern TVs. On top of that, Diddy Kong can ride on top of Donkey Kong during precarious sequences. It's a bit like the Sonic approach merged with the Donkey Kong Country approach, but in this case, either player dying loses lives for the team, giving added weight to Player 2. Then there's New Super Mario Bros. Or Mario Wonder. In New Super Mario Bros., up to 4 players can play the game at once, with more chaos ensuing, but as that's the case, there had to be compromises. The levels aren't designed with as much precision platforming or difficulty as previous games, because these newer games are trying to compromise with this idea of multiplayer. Players who are struggling can also go into a safety bubble, which is newcomer friendly, so skilled players can handle the more difficult sections. This works fine for multiplayer, but really compromises the single player experience. Mario Wonder attempts to solve that issue by making it so players will only bubble if they die, with a countdown to truly losing a life. If every player dies, that's when a stage has to be restarted. So, if one player is bad and another is good, this won't hamper the good player's progress. That's a better solution, I think, but it does automatically make the game easier in some ways, as even experienced players know they can die, but still have this new safety of their cooperative friends. There's also the issue of who's in charge of the screen if you're playing the game locally. One player is in charge of the screen, with the edges acting as walls for every other player. This makes it so no one will ever accidentally wander off screen, and is a great solution to that, although they might get smashed and die anyways by being forced into a wall or forced into an enemy. Players compete in a way for who's in charge of the screen by either being the one who's at the top of the flagpole or getting to be in charge of the screen if the current player in charge, indicated by a crown, dies. This is, again, a cool way to handle this, but also makes the game, in some ways, feel more competitive. There will be certain stages that might be unbearable if there's too many walls in multiplayer, as one player controlling the screen could so easily accidentally get them killed. So, do you design these elements of the game around multiplayer or single player? Additionally, it doesn't necessarily solve the fact that certain platforming obstacles are better handled by one person flowing through a game. For my final example, there's Sonic Superstars. Sonic Superstars also allows 2 players on screen at once, but unlike Sonic 2, both players can be in charge of the camera. While it definitely makes it feel like both players have equal weight, and one person isn't the primary player, as in the case of Sonic 2, it also comes with a whole host of problems. The game doesn't, and really can't know which player is leading the way. In some cases, a player might want to backtrack to follow a different route, but the camera doesn't realize that and follows the wrong person. In other cases, the camera doesn't follow the person who's technically in front, meaning the person ahead either has to wait or ends up screwing themselves over. It's difficult to predict, and all of this shows just how hard it is for a single camera to work in a multiplayer platform game. Even in the case of something like Mario Wonder, let's pretend players aren't on the same screen and get their own camera, well, now you still have to design around that. You can't have precision platform sections that are based on a timer, because the first player to get there will ruin the experience for the player in the back. This is also the case for jumping off of and destroying enemies to reach specific routes. Or you do keep all of this and just accept that the skilled player is probably going to have the better time playing the game than the less skilled players, or it's going to be general chaos as players destroy the routes for each other. I've kind of gone on a tangent here with various other games, but I just want to point out that while I think Sonic 2 has issues in how its cooperative multiplayer works, that's not to say there's this one perfect solution. It seems to work for what they intended, in it being an easy mode for a younger sibling to play with the older sibling, or less skilled player to tag along with a friend. It's not perfect, but this is a problem in 2D platform games I don't think any designer has truly cracked just yet. But hey, if there's an example in your mind I didn't bring up of the perfect co-op multiplayer 2D action platform experience that maintains the challenges and skill level of a single player mode, but still encapsulates that into a multiplayer that's fun without sacrifices, I'd genuinely love to know it. Beyond Tails, probably the most obvious mechanic shift up is that Sonic now has a new ability, that being the Spin Dash. To perform a Spin Dash, players simply need to hold down, then press the jump button, to then charge up Sonic for his rolling spin attack. It's the same move players saw in Sonic 1, but they no longer need to have speed to start the attack, and can also use this as an immediate speed boost without needing something like a spring. This is probably my favorite change-up from Sonic 1. It's something I criticized the first game for lacking, and it's also something that seems like was a common criticism of Sonic 1, as Hirokazu Yasuhara noted in one of his GDC presentations. To be fair, I did start playing Sonic 1 and 2 at around the same time, so from my young perspective, this move already existed, so playing Sonic 1 without it felt odd, as it feels so natural to the games. While I love the Spin Dash, as it allows players to immediately accelerate to high speeds and acts as an offensive tool, that's not to say it's not without its compromises. Sonic is a game that's often about speed. I don't mean in the sake of run as fast as you can at all times, but rather that there are frequently ramps that require speed to make it up. This is one of those things that sets Sonic apart in a good way, as it's a unique way to traverse and platform compared to other games. In Sonic 1, these acted as speed checks that meant players needed to either keep up a decent enough speed to make it up them, or backtrack in order to get enough distance to run fast enough to make it up them. To that end, they could serve a specific gameplay purpose of making sure players are typically playing at a somewhat brisk pace. With Sonic 2, these ramps no longer serve the same sort of speed check, for better or worse. Now, if a player comes across one of these, they can stop and spin dash to make it up, regardless of what speed they were traveling before. So it automatically changes the way these obstacles work. Certain ramped obstacles, like this half-pipe of Sonic 1's Spring Yard Zone, that are somewhat challenging in Sonic 1, would be much simpler and easier in Sonic 2 with this new move. At the same time, that's not a bad thing, and it just means that designers will have to design around this new tool. In fact, to my mind, it allows for a greater variation of challenges. It allows the designers to put more platforms above ramps players can shoot up to, as if a player messes up, they can easily go back and try again with far less hassle. It also allows the devs to place more enemies at the top of these ramps, as it's more likely players will be spinning and therefore in attack mode. That's not to say they couldn't do either of these things in Sonic 1 without the spin dash, but rather that these types of challenges make a little more sense with the spin dash ability. Additionally, you can now put these ramps in tight places where Sonic has to use the spin dash to gain enough speed. This actually allows for more ramps and more interesting vertical traversal using them, as you no longer need a runway in order to use these to gain height. I guess technically you could add a bumper for the same effect, but it's cleaner this way, the player has more control, and it feels like the team really took advantage of this for vertical traversal in Sonic 2. As I mentioned, the spin dash isn't just a traversal tool, but also an attack. It means players can more easily attack on the ground as, again, they don't need any sort of runway to use a grounded attack. While players could always run and press down to use the rolling spin attack, the spin dash is a little easier as players can stop and be a little more strategic. It means the devs can sprinkle in more enemies who hurt Sonic if Sonic jumps on them, but are destroyed by rolling, and it will feel more fair. Probably the most important aspect of the spin dash is simply that it feels fun to use. The Sonic games are touted to be about speed, and when Sonic is at his max speed, he goes incredibly fast. So, a move to instantly boost Sonic's speed without needing the slow, but necessary acceleration of Sonic feels good. On top of that, Sonic doesn't have a run button, like many platform games such as Mario do, so the spin dash, in a way, is Sonic's unique version of a run button. One more aspect of the spin dash worth mentioning is that the more players press the action button as they're holding down, the more it charges the spin dash, meaning the faster players will go once they let go. SonicRetro.org has a handy calculation for exactly how the spin dash works in this regard, so I'm going to basically regurgitate this to you as I find it interesting. Initially, the spin dash, or spin rev value, is set to 0. Each time the player presses the action button, a value of 2 is added to spin rev, with the max speed it can get to being 8. So, once players let go, they will shoot forward based on that value. However, the value of spin rev also slowly drops over time, with it dropping quicker the higher the value. What this means is that if players want to go at max speed, they'll have to quickly tap the button to rev up, and then let go before the timer has a chance to drop the value. It's a cool system because not only does it allow players to shoot to a max speed, but it also allows players to, in this way, choose their speed, and if they think they've overcompensated how fast they want to go, they can wait a moment for the spin rev value to drop. It's also fun, as it feels natural, as it's like revving up an engine to shoot forwards. The final thing to mention about spin dashing is something I briefly touched on, and that's the way to use it. In order to spin dash, players will have to hold down, then repeatedly press the jump button while holding down, then release down once they want to shoot forwards. To that end, it's definitely the most complex move Sonic has so far, and it's one that's a little less natural to accidentally stumble upon. The Sega Genesis only had 3 buttons, and all of them make Sonic jump. If players didn't know how to roll in Sonic 1, it was pretty likely they'd accidentally stumble upon this by pressing down at some point while running. While the spin dash isn't difficult to use, it's a little less likely players will stumble upon it. Yes, there's the off chance players will be ducking and then try to jump only to spin dash, but ducking in general isn't a move that's used too frequently in the Sonic games. I don't really remember how I learned to spin dash when I was a kid, as it was so long ago, but I'm sure another kid just told me. For someone alone and brand new, how would they learn? Well, games always came with an instruction manual, and it is right there in the manual, so there's that. But let's say you rented the game or bought it used. Sonic 2, like Sonic 1, has an introductory video of playing the game if players wait long enough during the title screen, and it's here that players will see the computer use the spin dash. So unless there's a tutorial stage or area, which stage 1 in a video game can often serve as, this is probably about the best way a game could handle showcasing a more complex move like this. That said, watching the gameplay during this sequence, it was notable to me just how long it takes before Sonic uses his spin dash. It's the brand new move, so you'd think it would be the first thing shown, but instead we get a general showcase of running and jumping first, with the spin dash taking a while to get to. So that's going to be my one real critique with this. I do think the team should have shown off the spin dash sooner during its gameplay showcase. One aspect to Sonic 1 I failed to mention was the max speed cap. At a certain point in the original Sonic 1, players will hit a max speed cap. There's altering accounts of why this is, and I honestly can't find a source that I find 100% reputable on this one. According to the Sonic fandom wiki, Sonic was given a maximum running speed, but it was reduced after Yuji Naka reportedly suffered from motion sickness. However, this one has citation needed, and the only account I can find of Yuji Naka talking about motion sickness is this article translated by Shmuplations, which is a fantastic site by the way, where Yuji Naka is describing in detail how the speed of 3D dungeon scrolling in Phantasy Star made people get motion sickness, which obviously has nothing to do with Sonic. The other account from the very same wiki is that playtesters reported motion sickness. This one cites Sonic the Hedgehog 25th Anniversary Artbook and Pixel Love's The History of Sonic the Hedgehog. But here's the thing, going through these books the best I can, which was difficult as I own neither of them, I couldn't find any account of this. As far as The History of Sonic the Hedgehog goes, I had to find YouTube videos of people flipping through the book, so I couldn't read everything, but the best I could manage to find was this quote: "Sonic the Hedgehog at the very beginning had such fast scrolling that it made you sick after a few minutes." From Sonic the Hedgehog 25th Anniversary Artbook, I found a quote from Yuji Naka. I put a lot of thought into how to successfully make Sonic look speedy. Since just scrolling the screen along where Sonic is running doesn't look too speedy, I made the parallax screens behind Sonic delay slightly. I think this made the players think Sonic is speeding faster than he actually is. Early in testing, the game at times even seemed too fast, with players reportedly becoming dizzy and nauseated. Listening to feedback, Naka gently slowed the scrolling speed. So both of these quotes have nothing to do with Sonic's actual run speed and are referring to the parallax scrolling speeds of the background. In other words, and I apologize using my game I'm working on as an example here, you can make a game look like this, or you can make a game look like this. You can correct your wikis now, thank you very much. I googled this and their crappy AI spat out Yuji Naka didn't get motion sickness, but his playtesters did, although mentioned the source of the claim was from reliable fan wikis. So I checked their sources, and again, it's just wikis and this random article from Helobrow, which I've never heard of before. It's a short opinion piece that says Sega Brass asked Yuji Naka to slow down Sonic's speed, again, with no actual source. So the confusing thing is that when talking about a speed cap, all of the games have this, in the sense that Sonic has a max speed, but there's a speed cap specific to Sonic 1, and then Sonic 2 and CD in how the running and air speeds work, and I don't even know if speed cap is the right word. There's also a lot of debate about the speed cap of Sonic 1 potentially being a bug, specifically because in Sonic 1, if players press the directional run button after hitting a bumper, Sonic will slow back down to a normal max speed. So it's possible this is a bug, but there's no specific confirmation I can find, and just because the programmers changed this for Sonic 2, CD, and then 3, doesn't mean it wasn't intentional for whatever reason with Sonic 1. If I had to hazard a guess about the max speed cap of Sonic 1, it was either due to the team struggling to make the game run smoothly, which Yuji Naka has talked about, and certain speeds caused issues from a technical standpoint, which if this is the case, I'm assuming they later ironed out for future Sonic games. Or it could have been because the team was concerned the game was too fast for players with no speed cap. They've talked about how they included Labyrinth Zone with the slow-moving water in Sonic 1 because they were concerned the speed was too fast for most gamers and wanted it as a break. So it could have been the speed cap was for that reason, to make it so players using a controller without rolling will always be in complete control of Sonic's speed. This is a very long aside and a bit of a rabbit hole, but I found it interesting. So all of this is to say, Sonic 1 has a speed cap, and Sonic 2 somewhat removes it, Very specifically, from what I can tell, it makes it so Sonic doesn't slow down after hitting something like a spring or speed booster and holding the run button without rolling, whereas he would have slowed down in Sonic 1. The speed cap in Sonic 1 mostly applies to if Sonic is running rather than rolling. That's also why I honestly forgot about it when making my first video, as I'm usually rolling since it also prevents Sonic from running into an enemy. The speed cap also applies to when Sonic is airborne. I find speed caps interesting for many reasons, especially after recently playing Sonic Cross Shadow Generations with a friend, and Sonic controls completely different in the 2D stages. Generally speaking, Sonic is supposed to be fast, but the question then becomes, how fast do you let Sonic get? What's fun, and what is manageable for a player to realistically be able to play? Sonic has a speed cap to this regardless of the slope he's running on, meaning that it doesn't matter if Sonic is running in a straight line or down, he's going to be running at the same speed, which can feel a little odd as it feels like maybe you should go a little faster running downhill. But players can achieve this by rolling, which will turn down the ground friction and has a different max speed from running. Taking away outliers like getting hit by a bumper, Sonic's max running speed is 6 pixels per frame, whereas his top roll speed is 16 pixels per frame. So, no matter which way you look at it, even though Sonic 2 removed some of the limitations around the speed caps of Sonic 1, Sonic's speed is meant to never be too excessive. While, yes, players can reach incredible speeds while rolling or through spin dashing, the levels are designed in a purposeful way to ensure players are never truly out of control, as players need to be rolling and therefore need a downward ramp to actually reach these speeds of 16 pixels per frame. The instances the team allows for ramps this large are rare, and when they appear, like in Chemical Plant Zone, they really stand out as cool set pieces. This is part of what I think makes the Sonic Sega Genesis games feel so good to play. As I mentioned, I was recently playing Sonic Cross Shadow Generations, and the speed cap is far higher than in the Sega Genesis games. While yes, Sonic feels faster, he also feels completely out of control. For me, that takes away from the fun factor. The Genesis games managed to find a nice balance where players feel faster while running at max speed, but for the most part, still in control. You can also slow down at any point by reversing directions, which also ensures this feeling. Meanwhile, rolling takes Sonic to incredible speeds, but there's still a ramp up to this, and it's necessary to have a downwards ramp to truly reach these top speeds. However, even this is still speed capped, which really shows, to me, the developers were crafting every situation the player could be in to ensure it all feels fair and fun. It actually all brings me back to those misquotes from Yuji Naka about toning down the screen scrolling. Yuji Naka very specifically implemented a huge amount of parallax scrolling in the Sonic games. His reasoning for this was to make sure players felt fast even if Sonic wasn't actually moving that fast. It's an illusion that helps sell Sonic's speed, but still keeps players in control. It's an incredible level of awareness here on what makes games fun, and not letting this desire for Sonic to be fast to oversee practical game design. If Sonic could keep running faster and faster, or his spin dash immediately boosted players to that 16 pixel per frame speed, yes, Sonic would feel like the fastest hedgehog alive, but I'd argue it wouldn't have become the breakout success that it was, because it wouldn't have been as fun to play. The one thing that feels a little odd to me is that Sonic runs the same max speed whether he's running on a flat surface or down a hill, as it feels like he should accelerate a little bit downhill. But this is another one of those things that's all about ensuring players have control at all times, even when running downhill. I do think the change from Sonic 1 to Sonic 2 was a good one, in making sure Sonic maintains the speed from hitting a spring without slowing down if the player starts hitting the run button. While it's nice to have control of the character, it feels odd that Sonic would suddenly slow down his momentum unless you start trying to backpedal. The question that I ponder is, should Sonic's run speed on a flat surface be 6 pixels per frame, but downhill, perhaps the code allow for him to reach 7 or 8 pixels per frame? Not as fast as rolling, but still something to show an added speed. Hills do make Sonic accelerate faster, so they're still going to give players a sense of speed and momentum if players aren't already running fast, but I suppose it's a question of consistency, as I think consistent rules are important in video games. In one sense, Sonic running at the same max speed no matter what is consistent. Players will always know what speed they can get to, and rolling will allow them to break that. Rolling is then consistent in and of itself, in that it's entirely based on the initial speed mixed with ramps. Running and rolling both have individual max speeds, so making it so running has two max speeds by making a separate one for traveling downhill, taking away from potential player confusion, eliminates that consistency. So in the end, I think I'm coming around to thinking the Sonic team made the better choice here in Sonic running the same max speed regardless of the angle. That was a lot on mechanics, so let's move on to Sonic 2's first area, Emerald Hill Zone. One of my favorite ways to really look at and think about these stages is zoomed out, and I was able to find full maps of the stages laid out on sonicretro.org, so thank you to whoever put these together and uploaded them. While Sonic 2's introductory stage doesn't have the daunting task of introducing players to a brand new game with brand new gameplay, as Sonic 1 had to do with Green Hill Zone, it still does need to cater to a few principles. This could be someone's first Sonic game they play, even with Sonic 1's popularity, and this is still stage 1, so it should really be about getting players used to the mechanics. To that end, similar to Sonic 1, the very start of the stage is sloped terrain to introduce players to the acceleration system of Sonic. Go up a hill and you'll slow down, go down and you'll speed up. We're introduced to rings right off the bat, and probably one of the most annoying enemies in the stage right next to them, these coconuts. They'll travel up and down a tree they're on, then launch a coconut at Sonic when he's in range. While this enemy can be immediately annoying, as it's, in my opinion, one of the more difficult enemies to reliably avoid in the game, that's not a complaint, and I think the placement here actually makes a lot of sense. Before I get into why, there's also a single buzzer right afterwards, a platform with a shield, or barrier, and another coconut right next to more rings. There's a pretty strong chance here that a number of things will happen, as they're designed to happen. Players will probably go for the rings, because it's a shiny thing to collect. If they get past the first coconut, they'll probably go for a shield, because it's right there, and more rings. All of this leads to a strong chance that they'll get hit by one of the two coconuts, which are both strategically placed right next to ring clusters. This is both tempting for players, as they'll want those rings, but then jump into a more dangerous zone for the coconuts, but also means they'll get those rings and then be safe when the coconut's coconut potentially hits them. So, if you're new to Sonic, you are immediately going to learn what rings do. The game tempts you into accidentally learning this, which is actually pretty brilliant. The same goes for the barrier, where players will also have a good chance of getting hit if they go for it. Now, right afterwards is yet another sequence that has a good chance of hitting new players, these mashers. They aren't difficult, but they do serve as obstacles that will hurt players if they're running and not rolling or jumping. And for a brand new player, there's a decent chance of that. So, what have we learned right off the bat? Rings and barriers protect us. Don't run without caution. Even though this is Sonic and it's supposed to be a game about speed, there are still obstacles. Coconuts can be difficult, and now we understand what they do in a safe way. There are item monitors. Hills and ramps affect Sonic's speed and acceleration. Like Sonic 1's Green Hill Zone, it's a sharp opening sequence that seems more focused on teaching players. I don't know if I'd call this opening the most fun, if I'm being honest, because it's more difficult to let loose and fly forwards like you would in Sonic 1, but that's also okay. It feels deliberate and a good way to teach players all of the mechanics they'll need to know. Finishing this sequence, players are introduced to yet another important feature to the Sonic games, and that's multiple paths. Players can either take an upper or lower path here, and it's pretty likely due to the gap many players might run into or fall into the lower section, where more ideas are presented. On the left are rings hidden behind a false wall, and underneath, a spring. So again, we're still learning new mechanics and quickly. The open window showing the rings is a brilliant way to introduce false walls without players needing to accidentally stumble upon them. There will be secrets. The spring, which we'd seen in Sonic 1, would still be new for a non-veteran player, and unlike the opening portion of the stage, here it does make sense for players to go fast and utilize that spring's speed boost. So, while players are at first shown to be cautious, they're still given leeway to go fast at the right time. Take the upper path and you'll be introduced to vertical springs as well as diagonal springs, with the diagonal springs being something new to Sonic 2. On top of that, if players fall at any point here, there are no insta-death pits, really hammering home the idea of multiple routes. Pulling back a little bit, something Sonic 2 does really well is moment-to-moment gameplay, and while you feel that when you're playing the stage, you really see a lot of that when you pull back and look at these maps as a whole. Let's look at this section right here after the bumper sequence. There are 3 potential paths to take. The top path has a diagonal spring, which will send players over a set of spikes and to a coconut and speed shoes. The middle path has rings, as well as mashers and waterfalls that could lead players to fall into the bottom path. The bottom path, meanwhile, is that speed zone where players can run fast to zoom past. Each area is unique in what its gameplay has, and each one has something interesting. And that's the thing that's so well done about the moment-to-moment gameplay of Sonic 2. It's not like everything necessarily has to be a challenge, but sometimes it is, and sometimes it's just something a little more interesting than moving forwards. The top route has a giant ramp which players will need to be moving fast enough to make it up. Is this challenging? Not really, but it's something different that changes the way players need to progress and adds a new moment. On top of that, this ramp is immediately after spikes and a coconut, so players just did something somewhat challenging involving enemies, so now there's a little break from that with a minor ramp challenge. While I don't intend to break down every single moment here, especially when I'm just gushing, it's worth pointing out in general how strong the moment-to-moment gameplay of Sonic 2 is, and it's something I'll be talking about again in Chemical Plant Zone. It really makes these levels feel intentional and handcrafted, which, look, every game of this era was, but the level design and enemy placement is particularly strong in Sonic 2. A couple more things I want to point out from Act 1. This corkscrew loop is introduced, which is another cool speed check similar to the loops introduced in Sonic 1. However, this one not only visually looks cool, but has a stronger purpose. While the loops were always speed checks, if a player doesn't have enough speed to pass a normal loop, they just go back and try again. With the corkscrews, if a player doesn't have enough speed, they'll instead drop down to a lower level. While this doesn't mean too much for the first corkscrew, the final one is a little more interesting in that if players fall down, they might be falling into mashers or a coconut and face a real repercussion that isn't simply dropping to the lower path. There's also a more interesting usage of loops in general in Emerald Hill Zone than in Sonic 1. What I'm talking about are these double loops that proceed downwards, which Emerald Hill Zone Acts 1 and 2 both have. As I talked about in my Sonic 1 video, while I do like the loops and think their cool factor alone justifies their existence, practically speaking, from a gameplay standpoint, they don't really do anything other than serve as a speed check. But here, they're not only used as that fun speed check, but because the top of the loop is also a platform, they simultaneously serve as platforms for the upper portion of the stage, making them much more interesting in that way. And look, Sonic 1 somewhat had this, as the top of a loop was still a platform, but it feels much more intentional here in Emerald Hill Zone as part of the pathing of the upper paths. Now, technically, you still don't need a loop. These could be hills that players run down on the lower path, with platforms on the upper path, and it would achieve the same thing. But come on, the loops are much cooler, and it was a fun way to double up on how cool the loops are by more properly incorporating them into the level design. Act 2 of Emerald Hill Zone is a lot more of the same, mostly 2 routes and occasionally 3. The challenges in the zone, in general, are either simple enemy challenges, with the enemies really acting more like minor obstacles players will need to avoid or destroy rather than true threats, the occasional spike here or there, speed zones, and obstacles blocking Sonic from truly going fast which players will need to deal with. There is one more set of spikes I failed to mention, which are these spikes that come in and out of the ground. It's not my favorite obstacle because it's not something players can necessarily immediately predict. These spikes pop in and out on a timer, and if you run into one, like other spikes, you won't get hurt. But they can pop out from under you and surprise you, and I don't know if I like the unpredictability of them. Yes, they are timed, so if you know the spikes are there, they're easy enough to avoid or time out. But the fact you could be running and then a spike suddenly pop out from under you doesn't seem like a great design choice to me. To the game's credit, these do always appear when the player would likely have rings, so it's not like it's something that's going to unfairly instantly kill the player, but it feels like maybe there should be some sort of indication these will be here, like a marking on the wall or ground, so players aren't potentially just surprise spiked. It's difficult for me not to compare Emerald Hill Zone to Green Hill Zone from Sonic 1. Not just because they're the starting zones, but visually they're pretty reminiscent of each other. Green Hill Zone feels a little more open and flowing to me than Emerald Hill Zone, whereas Emerald Hill Zone has moments of speed and then moments of obstacles and back and forth. I think as a kid, I slightly preferred Green Hill Zone of the two for this reason, but I still really enjoy Emerald Hill Zone and think it's a strong introductory stage. Another interesting thing about Emerald Hill Zone, to me, is I think it actually sets the tone of Sonic 2 a little better than Green Hill Zone sets the tone of Sonic 1. And what I mean by that is, Green Hill Zone is pretty free-flowing overall, as I mentioned, but Sonic 1 then has a mix of obstacle-heavy, slower stages, like Marble Zone or Labyrinth Zone, with only one other free-flowing feeling stage in Starlight Zone. Sonic 2's stages, though, mostly feel pretty reminiscent in their ideas to Emerald Hill Zone. The obstacles, enemies, and layouts change, but the feel of the stages is a little more similar to me, which probably says more about the consistent overall design of Sonic 2 compared to Sonic 1, and the nature of a team making a sequel and knowing a bit more of what they think works and doesn't work after completing a first game. One more aspect to Emerald Hill Zone is that it's one of the very few zones where players can find enough checkpoints, or star posts, to get all of the Chaos Emeralds they need to become supersonic. There are 7 Chaos Emeralds and 8 checkpoints throughout the first 2 acts. It's an interesting choice because it means that players can unlock Supersonic here, right off the bat, and have him accessible in every single zone. It also means that players might choose to wander through Acts 1 and 2, spending 20 minutes only completing special stages, which is usually what I do. On one hand, for people who do want to do that, it can make the first zone feel a little tedious as you're really just focused on collecting rings and getting through these special stages. But it also helps take away a lot of the frustration that was possible in Sonic 1. As Sonic 1 only gives players one chance at the end of the first 2 acts to get a Chaos Emerald, I find it nice that you can knock this all out in Zone 1. Or alternatively, you can mess up on some of the harder special stages and not feel like you've lost out on getting Supersonic at some point in the game. So to that end, I happen to really appreciate this choice of letting dedicated players farm for Chaos Emeralds. It's a choice, so it's not like you need to do this if you want to play quickly, and it takes away from frustration if you happen to fail at one of the special stages. I mean, hell, you can always reset the game at this point too if you mess up on special stages and not feel like you lost too much progress. On top of that, it means Supersonic is technically accessible throughout the whole game, which can be a fun reward if you choose to do this. There are a few notable updated mechanics in Emerald Hill Zone players should notice that I'd like to touch upon. The first of these are the springs. Sonic 1 had horizontal and vertical springs, with the color of the spring indicating its strength. A red spring was stronger than a yellow spring. However, Sonic 2 introduces diagonal springs. As their name implies, these springs launch players both vertically and horizontally. While horizontal springs would set Sonic's X speed to the same power as its value, and vertical springs would set Sonic's Y speed to the same power as its value, in Sonic 2, 3, and Knuckles, diagonal springs set both Sonic's X and Y speed to the same power as their value. So if its value is 16, which is the value of a red spring, Sonic's X and Y speed are both set to 16. Now, the interesting thing about this is, because you're traveling diagonally, this actually means that you're traveling faster than a horizontal or vertical spring, which only affects one value, because, you're covering far more distance. Nothing wrong with that, but just a fun bit of math, and it's something Sonic CD actually accounts for in the way its diagonal springs work. Either way is fine, it really just depends on how powerful the developers wanted the springs to feel. Back to design, I think the diagonal springs are a fantastic addition to the Sonic games. Bouncing around and feeling like a pinball is part of the fun of Sonic, and these diagonal springs not only do that, but allow for additional interesting level design, which we see immediately in Emerald Hill Zone. It allows for a quick new way to traverse that isn't simply jumping to progress, and allows platforms to be higher and further away. On top of springs being updated for Sonic 2, the spikes were also updated in Sonic 2, or corrected. I forget where the argument landed on if the way they function in Sonic 1 was a bug or not. So, in Sonic 1, if players landed on a spike, their iframes wouldn't activate and they'd bounce to the side. This could mean that they'd bounce off to safety, but more than likely, their iframes wouldn't activate, they'd lose their rings, and then bounce right back onto the spikes again to end up dying. So, in that way, usually spikes acted akin to an instant death. And while that's okay, I mean, the Mega Man series has plenty of instant death spikes, Sonic 2 changes this by making sure Sonic's iframes do activate after hitting spikes, meaning it really just serves as another obstacle, similar to an enemy, but immobile and unable to be destroyed. Overall, I think the Sonic games are meant to be a little more forgiving than a game like Mega Man. While insta-death exists in the form of falling to your doom or being crushed, that's pretty much it. And with Sonic, I think that makes sense due to the game's speed. While I don't personally mind the challenge of insta-death obstacles, how frustrating they are has to be balanced with other factors. And in the case of Sonic, I think it makes sense for these to be used much more sparingly, because too much insta-death will really hamper players from wanting to move quickly, as a mistake will cost them so dearly. So, having an easy, reusable obstacle like spikes that simply injure the players for landing on them makes a lot of sense, and I think this was a positive update for the Sonic games. For completing Emerald Hill Zone, players will reach their first Robotnik battle of Sonic 2, the Egg Drillster. This is about as basic of a boss fight as you can get. The Egg Drillster simply moves back and forth with a pointy drill at the end, so all players are asked to do is jump over it and onto Robotnik. Once the Egg Drillster has 1 health left, the drill shoots out, which is about as intense as this fight gets. While it's simple and honestly not as creative as Green Hill Zone's Egg Wrecker boss fight, this is the first zone, and this sort of easy back and forth boss fight makes a lot of sense. Really, all the team is doing is making sure the players have a basic handle on jumping and avoiding obstacles, and I don't think you need much else here. I have something similar for the prologue boss in the game I'm working on, so I get it. While it's not entirely interesting, and is probably one of the easiest boss fights in any of the Genesis Sonic games, it serves its purpose of being a simple challenge. As I mentioned with Emerald Hill Zone, players will find all 7 Chaos Emeralds through checkpoints if they have 50 rings when they activate the checkpoint. This is a pretty major change-up from Sonic 1, where players would access the special stages by having 50 rings at the end of a stage, and then jump into a giant ring that would appear. To my opinion, this is a fantastic change-up in just about every way, but I do want to compliment one aspect of the Sonic 1 version. I think in Sonic 1, it must have been a pretty shocking and fun surprise for players when they first come upon the giant ring and don't know why. I was so young when I first played Sonic 1 that I honestly don't remember that experience, but I imagine it must have been a cool feeling. The drawback, though, was that it was much more challenging to get every Chaos Emerald. Having 50 rings by the end of the stage, especially later stages when the most difficult portions might be packed near the end, could be difficult. On top of that, one failed attempt is one less chance to get all of the Chaos Emeralds. Although, probably the largest drawback is, if you're doing this by stage, that's automatically going to limit how many attempts players have. For Sonic 1, every stage had 3 acts, with only 2 of those having a special stage, as the final act was always a boss. That meant players only had 10 chances to get the 6 Chaos Emeralds of Sonic 1. I say 10 because you can't access the special stages in Scrap Brain Zone. If Sonic 2 were to stick to the same method, there's 7 Chaos Emeralds and 9 acts without a boss, but there are 62 checkpoints in Sonic 2. So, instead of 9 chances to get all 7 Chaos Emeralds, players have 62 chances. So, it makes the process a whole lot less frustrating by virtue of opportunities alone. Not only that, but Sonic 2 also introduces Super Sonic. While players didn't receive anything for obtaining all of the Chaos Emeralds in Sonic 1 outside of the alternate good ending for obtaining every Chaos Emerald in Sonic 2, players can transform into the incredibly powerful Super Sonic. Meaning, had Sonic 2 stuck to the original method of reaching the special stages at the end of the act, only the best players would be able to obtain Super Sonic, and even then, they'd only be able to use him by the end of Oil Ocean Zone at the earliest. As I mentioned earlier, I also think it's fun that players can, if they so choose, unlock Super Sonic right from the jump in Emerald Hill Zone. So overall, definitely a nice change up here with accessing special stages. And speaking on those special stages, they were also drastically changed for Sonic 2. While Sonic 1 saw Sonic in a giant rotating platform, which was a technical marvel for the time, it also wasn't very fun, to my opinion, of course. So with Sonic 2, the team came up with a brand new special stage that was also a technical marvel for the time. In fact, there's a great video on how some of the techniques employed to make this special stage work were done by coding secrets that I'll link to in the description. This time around, players run along a giant 3D ramp collecting rings that appear along the ramp and avoiding bombs. Players will be asked to collect a certain number of rings 3 times, with the total amount of rings culminating. Reach the end, and players will receive their Chaos Emerald. However, along the way, if players run into a bomb, they'll lose 10 rings. And if you miss the ring requirement, you're booted out of the special stage and lose 1 attempt at obtaining a Chaos Emerald and Super Sonic. The special stages never change, so that does mean that players can go back in with some memorization and have a bit of an easier time. The ramp will twist and turn or go up and down, which looks cool, but oftentimes blocks the player from seeing what's coming up ahead. And therein lies the issue. Well, that and draw distance, especially on the original Genesis version. Frequently, where rings or bombs are going to appear is a complete surprise, or it comes so rapidly that players don't have enough time to react. To make things a little easier, usually there are patterns to these, so once you spot a pattern, it does repeat. And from playing enough, I've come to realize that typically, if the path is turning, rings will usually be on the far side of the turn. But that's still not always the case, and that was me memorizing something rather than reacting to it and achieving it in the moment. Additionally, there's a draw distance issue where rings and bombs don't appear at the furthest point they should in the original Sega Genesis version, meaning players have even less time to react to these. So what you end up with is a minigame that, in my opinion, is pretty fun as it's running around and collecting things as they come while reacting to and avoiding obstacles. I mean, it's kind of like the infinite runner genre that Temple Run popularized for a time. But one that's marred by technical limitations in the draw distance and by poor choices with the ramp completely blocking the player from seeing what's coming and having enough time to react. I think an alternate version of this that might have been more universally liked would have either reduced how much the ramp turned or tilted so players could see more when it did these things, or only utilized the drastic twists and turns as a fun visual gimmick in between challenges, rather than throwing the challenges in as part of those gimmicks. Or, if they were combined, simply making those sections a little easier. There are other things you could do on modern hardware, like a partially see-through ramp, meaning players could see what's coming in the distance even if the ramp would have been blocking their view, but I'm trying to stick to minor design tweaks here within the confines of the minigame and Genesis architecture. While I'd say Sonic 1's special stages are mostly disliked from what I've seen online, Sonic 2's special stages are pretty divisive. It seems like more people dislike them than like them, but it also seems to have its fans. And I happen to be one of those fans. While it's not my favorite Sonic special stage, I enjoyed it far more than the special stages of Sonic 1. It has its problems, to be sure, and part of my enjoyment likely comes from years of having memorized portions of these, but this type of reactionary gameplay is something I enjoy, and I think the visual gimmick here is pretty cool. So, not the best special stage, but definitely an improvement. This time around, for getting every Chaos Emerald, players will unlock Super Sonic. According to Sonic artist Yasushi Yamaguchi, or Judy Totoya, the very same artist who came up with Tails, the only reason Super Sonic came into being was thanks to manga artist Tamakichi Sakura. Tamakichi-san wrote a column for the ultra-popular Famitsu magazine in Japan about how disappointed he was by the lack of reward in Sonic 1 and the true ending. This led the Sonic team to quickly come up with a better concept, and the idea of Super Sonic solidified quickly. While I can't find a direct quote, it seems pretty clear Super Sonic's design was highly inspired by the Super Saiyans of Dragon Ball. Although, notably, while there are 7 Dragon Balls and 7 Chaos Emeralds in Sonic 2, according to Yasushi Yamaguchi, that was a total coincidence. There were 6 Chaos Emeralds in Sonic 1, and players didn't receive anything for it, so the team added a 7th secret one to Sonic 2, which is what transforms Sonic, and makes it so there's a reason Sonic doesn't transform in the first game. From a gameplay standpoint, Super Sonic serves as a combination of having invincibility and the speed shoes. Although, notably, his top speed isn't as high as wearing the power sneakers, while his acceleration is much faster. To balance him out a little bit, as he's so overpowered, Super Sonic can only be activated once players have 50 rings, and even then, he'll slowly drain the player's rings while in use, and once players hit 0 rings, Sonic will transform back to normal Sonic. So, why have Super Sonic's max speed lower than that of wearing power sneakers? While it might not make sense from a story perspective, it does from a gameplay standpoint. The power sneakers are a temporary boost that only lasts around 15 seconds. As such, the team could give Sonic a practically out-of-control max speed, as it was a temporary state the players would be in. However, with Super Sonic, this is a state that players will be in for at least 50 seconds, if not longer if the player collects more than 50 rings at any point. While the power sneakers might be fun if players are invincible, they're still pretty unwieldy, so it makes sense the team would want to tone down the max speed of a state the players are in for far longer and make it a little more controllable. But by drastically upping the acceleration, it still feels incredibly fast even if it has a lower max speed. Even then, with supersonic speed, it's pretty easy to accidentally get into trouble, especially in later stages where there are plenty of obstacles that crush Sonic if he's in the wrong place at the wrong time. So I think all around, the choice to limit supersonic speed was a good one. For the most part, Supersonic is a fantastic reward for players who collect all 7 Chaos Emeralds. While it has its problems in being a little unwieldy, it also feels like that's the point, and it's completely optional. The one major downside to Supersonic in Sonic 2 is that players will automatically transform into Supersonic when they jump after obtaining 50 rings. In Sonic 3, this was changed so Sonic will only become Supersonic if they hit the action button a second time while in the air, making it so players could choose when to transform into Supersonic. Notably, remakes like Sonic Origins also opt for this method in Sonic 2. Because players automatically transformed in the original game, that means they could accidentally become Supersonic during a point in the stage that's precarious, and they'd naturally want more caution with a slower Sonic. It also meant that Supersonic consuming rings could work especially against them, as they might run out of both Supersonic and therefore rings at the worst possible time. I think that's a bit of an oversight on this reward. I understand the team likely wanted players to immediately transform into Supersonic and wanted it to be a surprise, therefore a secondary way to activate Supersonic that's never explained might make it so players completely miss this reward. But that want to make this ability self-activate comes with that pretty major drawback of it auto-activating when players might not want it to. Overall though, Supersonic is a fantastic new addition to the Sonic series, and it's nice to get a true reward after obtaining all of the Chaos Emeralds. For defeating the Egg Drillster, players will make it to possibly the most iconic stage of Sonic 2, Chemical Plant Zone. Whereas Emerald Hill Zone focused on a mix of spring bumpers, small ramps, corkscrews, loops, and minor easy obstacles, like simple enemies and spikes, for players to avoid, Chemical Plant Zone focuses on giant ramps, speedy moments, spinners that shoot players forwards, a maze-like feeling, spring platforms, these timed block platforms that shift positions, and water traps. It's an entirely new set of tools, and yet it still feels like it follows a general Sonic 2 gameplay design philosophy, which brings the whole game together, with moments of speed broken up by minor platforming challenges and multiple routes. It's difficult not to gush about just how strong the level design of this stage in particular is. The stage takes players in all sorts of dizzying directions, and yet manages to make it clear which direction the player needs to go. While the player might run down a giant ramp and loop, then be propelled backwards by a spring, now going in the opposite direction, whatever direction you're heading is the correct one. Part of the way the team was able to do this was in having ramps that become a part of the background or foreground after players have used them, allowing the team to create much more interesting pathing that's not so left or right. On the same token, as shown at the very beginning of the stage, there might be 2 routes shown on screen at once, with only the route the player has chosen activated, meaning players might go through the exact same location twice, but on different routes. This concept is shown to players right off the bat, with an incredibly cool twisting and interweaving pipe which players will run along as they visually see Sonic interweaving with the pipe they've chosen. If players choose the top path, They'll eventually go over a loop and down a giant pipe, interweaving with a different part of the stage as they progress forwards. But if players instead choose the bottom path at the beginning of the stage, they'll go down a different loop. If they hop over the spring in front of them, they'll come to the very same pipe sequence as the top route, but now as that alternate route. While this alone gives the stage the ability to have incredibly cool moments where the paths all seem to converge in on themselves, the team smartly added these spinner transportation pipes. I don't know what they're actually called, by the way, but I'm going to give them that name. These pipes can transport the players anywhere the team wants, really helping the designers have the ability to make this stage feel like a maze. They also serve as clear progress markers for players who might be lost, but once you hop into one of these, you'll know you've made some sort of forwards progress. The second act, in particular, takes advantage of all of this in such an incredible way. Players will run down a giant ramp heading to the right before working their way back up. Once they've made it back up, they'll then find themselves traveling to the left and going into a travel tube that will take them to one of two different ramps heading down a different giant ramp going left in the exact same area as the first giant ramp. Make it through this, and players will then travel back to the right to the same area from the beginning of the stage, but now with a completely new route open to them. You might have noticed I mentioned these travel tubes could take players to one of two different spots. This is supposed to be random, although really, to my understanding, it's based on if the seconds on the timer are odd or even when the player enters the tube. The seeming randomness of these travel tubes helps to make the stage feel even more like a maze, with players unsure which way to go other than forwards. Looking at all of this, especially Act 2, the level design is both brilliant and inspiring in just how well the game is able to create unique routes with a confined space that feels maze-like but still has clear and readable progression. Chemical Plant Zone is probably the stage most about speed in all of Sonic 2. To complement this, the team also added these new speed boosters which will automatically shoot Sonic forwards when he touches them. While the springs were a great way to give players a controlled way to get a boost of speed, they also have the minor issue of, oftentimes, players needing to stop and reverse directions to hit them in order to shoot forwards. So here, you have a fantastic solution for shooting players forwards without needing to stop any sort of momentum. It's definitely something that needs to be used sparingly, as going too fast and out of control isn't always a positive in Sonic, but it's fun that this stage was designed with these in mind. While most of Chemical Plant Zone is this fun mix of speedy boosts and ramps with the occasional platforming, the second half of Act 2 suddenly drastically boosts the difficulty by adding this rising water section. While there's a safe introductory section early on, for the rest of the time, should players fall in, it's going to either result in a death from an instant death pit or via drowning. The first true test with the rising water is this climbing section with these rotating blocks. These blocks have been placed in various earlier sections throughout Chemical Plant Zone, and while most of the stage is about speed, these are the spots that are suddenly about slowing down and being patient. If the whole stage were these, that would be annoying, but I think they actually serve as a nice counter and contrast to the speedy portions of the stage. This section in particular asks players to be patient, which also laughably contrasts the rising water that would make most players feel impatient as Sonic can drown. While I actually like this challenge a lot, I do find it a little odd that this is the first time we're specifically seeing this challenge of players needing to jump from one rotating block sequence to another, and it's during the highest stakes of the stage. Really, this type of challenge probably should have been lightly introduced at an earlier point in the stage. And when I say lightly introduced, I mean having two of these rotating blocks over a safe area to drop, so players are familiar with this platforming concept before the true challenge. Afterwards, players are now asked to go a little slower and more cautious before yet another new concept in these platforms that rotate out on a timer, meaning players can easily drop to their watery doom. Again, another great concept, but maybe not the best spot to introduce it. While I do have these very minor critiques of Chemical Plant Zone, there's a good reason this stage is so beloved. Something I actually wonder about Chemical Plant Zone is if it was originally intended to be a later game stage. While Sonic 1 doesn't have very much cohesion in terms of which stage you travel to and when, originally that wasn't the case, and the stage order was meant to go from nature to slowly transitioning into industrial. This stage order was changed as the game was wrapping up production, and the team reorganized stages based on difficulty. Sonic 2 once again has no real cohesion to the stage order in terms of locations. First, you're in the tropical Emerald Hill Zone, before suddenly being in the industrial Poison Factory of Chemical Plant Zone, and then you pop out into the Aquatic Ruin before ending up in a casino. So it makes me wonder if Sonic 2 went through a similar reordering in terms of the stages. I know there was this initial concept of time travel, but that concept was scrapped pretty early on. And to that point, I wonder if Chemical Plant Zone was made Stage 2 because the team knew just how impressive it was and wanted to show it off, or if it was a difficulty thing. For making it through Chemical Plant Zone, players will reach Robotnik as Egg Poison. The Egg Poison battle takes place in an arena surrounded by those flipping platforms. Egg Poison will soak up some of the weird poison goop that this water really seems to be, and then attempt to drop it on Sonic. Once he finishes filling up, he'll reach his jar of goop out, with it dropping when it's directly over the player, giving the player only a short period of time to avoid the goop. While Sonic will lose rings when he's hit by the goop, the true danger of the battle lies in those flipping platforms, as falling off will lead to Sonic's death. Furthermore, getting hit by the goop will knock Sonic back, with a chance Sonic will be knocked back to his doom. This is also one of those battles where, if you're playing with Tails, Tails can activate Robotnik's iframes, meaning Sonic might jump right through him. So interestingly, all of that actually makes this battle one that's easier to play as Sonic alone, as Egg Poison doesn't have too much health, and you can pretty easily repeatedly bounce off of him as Sonic solo. Playing with Tails means you'll have to be a little more cautious so you don't jump to your doom. As with most Robotnik battles in the Genesis games, the fight itself is simple, as Robotnik only has one attack. However, it's difficult enough to avoid that. I think this is actually one of the most challenging boss battles in Sonic 2, specifically because mistakes are so dire. To that end, I think this is actually a well-balanced fight in the sense that Egg Poison is a bit of a glass cannon. Yes, he can easily kill Sonic, but he also doesn't have too much health and is always open to being attacked. It's a fight that asks players to be a bit patient if they want to be safe, especially when he gets out his goop, which is actually in line with the second half of Chemical Plant Zone. The only true problem I have with this fight is how unfair Tails can make the fight feel, as dying due to Tails activating Robotnik's iframes is a frustrating feeling. The best solution is probably making it so Robotnik will always make Sonic bounce off no matter what, even if iframes are activated, rather than having Sonic fly through him. But I do wonder if that might have made the battle a little too easy, as he's a pretty big target. The other solution I can think of is simply making it so Tails can't be around during this boss battle, similar to how Tails isn't around to help Sonic in both Wing Fortress or Death Egg Zone. Otherwise, I'm honestly not sure what other solutions there might be to the Tails problem other than changing this fight. But I do think, sans Tails, this is a good boss battle, so I'll turn it to you watching. Do you mind Tails in this boss battle? And if Tails does bother you, what do you think the best solution might have been? Defeat Egg Poison, and players will make it to Aquatic Ruin Zone. Aquatic Ruin Zone is Sonic 2's version of a water level. However, while Sonic 1's Labyrinth Zone forces players into the water, the team smartly realized with Aquatic Ruin Zone that while water is a great obstacle in how it works, an entire stage set in water kinda tampers with a big part of what makes Sonic so fun to play. So while we'd mostly seen stages with 2 different routes up to this point, Aquatic Ruin Zone instead has 3, and sometimes 4 running routes throughout its 2 acts. The top routes are the safest as they're above the water. Not only that, but they're the faster routes as Sonic isn't chugging through said water. But while they're faster and safer, they are all about platforming, and have plenty of drops throughout that can see players accidentally finding themselves in one of the lower routes. While players can take their time on the upper routes, the team also attempted to create more obstacles that would force players back down. This includes plenty of wisps, which can overwhelm and knock the player back down. The enemies of the stage, such as the Grounders and Chop Chops, are regularly strategically placed in spots where Sonic won't be grounded while spinning, meaning they seem to be able to hurt him. The Grounders in particular are fun as they burst out of walls and can surprise players. I particularly like this Grounder in Act 1, who's strategically after a drop and right before a loop. One of the more interesting obstacles here is the foreground. While there were occasionally minor foreground elements, like trees, prior to this, The foreground here is specifically designed to block the view of players. This can block the view of interesting higher routes, or even block players from noticing there's gaps in the ground if they're not paying attention, causing them to fall to a lower route from what would otherwise be an easy jump. It's a great way to strategically obscure the view of players, all while creating a unique element to this stage. I especially like how thoughtful the placement was, and how sometimes it feels like a cool decoration, while other times serves this gameplay purpose. Even then, the team managed to make it so this type of obstacle, which could easily become frustrating and annoying as it blocks the player's view, is never overused nor overstays its welcome. To add to the plethora of ways Aquatic Ruin tries to force players into the dangerous lower portion of the stage, there are a number of sections with crumbling ground. This isn't new to Sonic, but it's infrequent, and this is definitely the right stage to reintroduce this. Another obstacle that could easily cause players to drop below are these arrow shooting traps. As the name implies, they simply shoot arrows at a steady pace, which players will need to avoid. The reason I lump them in as something which can cause the player to drop is that it's easy to feel like Sonic needs to outrun these, and if the player attempts that, it means they're likely no longer in control and could very easily make a mistake dropping below. While the upper portion of the stage feels mostly meant to make players drop, the water section is then unique in all of the ways it attempts to hinder players. The obvious part of this is the water, where players will always be under a time limit where they could drown unless they get air. But on top of that, there are false routes the player will need to navigate, as well as dropping columns which can easily crush Sonic, instantly killing him. The false routes, in particular, make for a unique section that specifically makes sense with the time limit of the water. While the columns that can crush Sonic might feel a little abundant, that does also seem like the entire point of this section. The player has plenty of opportunities to stay above water, so with that, the bottom path had to be made extra dangerous, otherwise it wouldn't feel like a punishment for dropping down there. This again feels like another fantastic stage that manages to feel unique compared to the rest, thanks to its overall gimmick of stay as high as you can to avoid the water. While it doesn't manage to be quite as memorable as something like Chemical Plant Zone, I enjoy the variety it provides, and that restraint in not using the water as much as Sonic 1's Labyrinth Zone saw. Complete Aquatic Ruin Zone, and players will reach the Egg Hammer boss fight. This one is a fun one, as it incorporates the totem pole arrow shooters of the stage into its boss design. Here, Robotnik will smash a totem pole with a hammer, and from that, an arrow will randomly shoot out of one of 4 different totem pole mouths. This arrow then acts as the obstacle players will need to avoid, but also becomes a platform once it sticks to the other side. Robotnik is just out of reach of players, so this platform will then give players the opportunity to attack Robotnik. That, or clever players can simply jump on top of one of the totem poles, and then bounce off of Robotnik repeatedly from there to quickly take him out, unless, Tails screws you over with this. It's an interesting idea in that going to the top of the totem pole makes this an incredibly simple battle with no real obstacles. And this was definitely intentional, as if the team didn't want this, they would have made the totem poles reach the top of the screen. So they definitely wanted players to have these 2 different methods for attacking the Egg Hammer. It's kind of funny to me, because when I'm thinking about designing bosses, I'm usually trying to think about how can the player cheese a boss, and how do I very specifically prevent that? As an example, for that prologue boss I showed you earlier, we realized players could cheese our boss by repeatedly bouncing on it over and over again. So, to prevent that, we made it so the boss would detect a player doing this and then do a very specific leaping attack. However, here, the team seems to be encouraging the cheese, which I might not have thought to do, but I also really enjoyed that about this boss. Ultimately, Sonic isn't really a game about boss battles, or battles at all for that matter. I mean, if you take a look at any of the enemies, they're all one-hit kill enemies that are really more so moving obstacles than anything else. And to the point of Sonic being about speed, having a secondary method to defeat Robotnik that's much quicker falls in line with that overall design philosophy. And you know what? It was definitely fun the first time I discovered this method for defeating the Egg Hammer. I was proud of myself when I was a kid, and I always remembered it, and ultimately, that's the goal here with this type of game. Defeat the Egg Hammer, and players will reach the pinball stage of Sonic 2, Casino Night Zone. Casino Night Zone really is all about that pinball. The entire stage is obstacles, and there's only one single enemy type in both acts, which also acts as a bumper that bounces players. So this stage is interesting then, because really, the only actual threat in Casino Night Zone are these smashing blocks and the occasional spike. It's really just a stage about bouncing around like a pinball, complete with bumpers and flippers, while occasionally bouncing into a slot machine that can reward Sonic with a lot of rings, or take them all away. To me, this stage is a bit like an upgraded version of Spring Yard Zone from Sonic 1. While the concept of Spring Yard Zone seemed to be within the name, having a stage that really utilized springs, it also felt like the first game's attempt at a pinball stage. And here, we have that vision truly brought to life. So, my question is, do you like it? Because I have mixed feelings on the stage. It is kind of fun aimlessly bouncing around trying to find the exit, but there also never really feels like there's much threat, because there isn't. For the most part, these are bouncing challenges, where I guess you could argue the real threat of the stage is the time limit. The bouncing is all based on angles, with players needing to actually be pretty precise to be in control. Granted, there's areas where you're so rapidly bouncing from one object to another, it's difficult to have any ounce of control at all, which is another aspect that can be both enjoyable, as an out-of-control experience can be exciting and fun to watch, but then also frustrating at times. In particular, when I think of sections that frustrate me in Casino Night Zone, I always come back to this one area in Act 2, where you're supposed to spin dash up a ledge, then choose which bumper to bounce on, and somehow it always likes to spit me right back out to where I came from. For some, this stage probably comes as a welcome relief. You just had to deal with a difficult Robotnik boss and Egg Poison, then avoid possible death and doom from the waters of Aquatic Ruin Zone. So might as well gamble and bounce your stress away. But the counter to that is that this level can feel pretty long if you're not like one of those expert speedrunners. A lot of times I'll find myself accidentally falling into a slot machine when I didn't particularly want to, and then there's so much bouncing around, sometimes hoping for the best, it can feel like a time sink. One major perk to this stage, even if it feels like a time sink, is this is one of those stages where you can focus on getting rings and hitting jackpots in the slot machines, which isn't too difficult to do. So if you're a struggling player, this level can not only be a relief because it's a break within the action stages, but also because it's a way to get some extra lives. If I were to lay a critique at this stage, there are multiple sections where in order to progress, Sonic needs to destroy some bumper at the bottom of the pinball table, then essentially fail at the pinball table to move forwards. This is pretty counter to how I think, and while I know those sections now, my natural inclination is to want to climb up and see how high I can get, as that seems like it's supposed to be the challenge, only for that to be the wrong direction. The argument against that is, if it were too difficult to climb up to the top of a pinball area, especially considering this isn't really normal Sonic gameplay, that could turn off a lot of players, and it's the safer choice to make failing a pinball table the way to progress, with bouncing around being an optional bit of fun. For finishing Pinball Zone, or Casino Night Zone, players will make it to the Egg Claw or Catcher Eggman boss. While Casino Night Zone is one of the easiest stages in the game, with no real threats, ironically, Catcher Eggman is one of the more difficult bosses of the game. He'll move back and forth across a pinball table, while a laser protects his bottom. Every so often, he'll drop a spiked ball that breaks into a mini AoE when it hits the ground. His pattern is simple, but there's only a couple ways to hit him. One is jumping on the pinball flippers, then using the flipper to smash into him. This is what I did as a kid, and it can be challenging to time this out properly without accidentally hitting his bottom. Granted, you can always get lucky and fall back down onto him if you overshoot to the top of the screen. The other method, and definitely the better one, is to spin dash up the wall, then wall jump off of it into Catcher Eggman's side. This was a technique I don't believe I knew how to do when I was a kid, although it immediately came to me when I got older. This method drastically reduces his difficulty, but it's also an advanced technique many players, especially newer players, won't know how to do. So, like the Egg Hammer before, that means there's actually two distinct ways to defeat this boss, with one method being the more advanced method and the better method. I really enjoy the more advanced method for defeating Catcher Eggman. It's a great bit of precision platforming and timing, which makes players feel good for utilizing a technique that's not often required in the game. And because it's not required very often, I think it was a good thing they included an alternate method to defeat Catcher Eggman with the flippers. Although, ironically, that's far more challenging to do, and it makes this fight extra tough for beginners compared to seasoned Sonic players. It does make me question if this fight might be a little too tough for the standard method, although it also comes at the end of an incredibly simple stage, so at the very least, there's a good chance players will be coming into this with a decent amount of lives. It's a fight I distinctly remember disliking when I was a kid due to its difficulty, although, ironically, now it's one of my favorite fights as I now use the wall bounce method, so that memory is something I'm trying to bear in mind with how I think about this fight. If this fight were altered at all, thinking about beginners, they could have made the electricity turn on and off with a timer, leaving some more openings for players to hit Catcher Eggman from the bottom using the flippers. It's a tough balance. As I said, this is a fun fight for someone more advanced, and it's okay to have a difficult fight, really, at any point. Everyone has a different tolerance for different types of difficulty. I think of Sonic as being a platform game that's overall more on the easier side, and as I've mentioned, one that's not really about battles and more so about platforming and obstacles. So that's in part why my thought process is going towards wondering about the difficulty of this particular boss fight. While I or you watching this might enjoy these challenges, Sonic is a game with an incredibly huge reach, so it's worth thinking a little broader than what I, very specifically, might prefer and who's playing the game. What specifically was the aim of the devs, and how difficult were they hoping for these battles to be? Defeat Catcher Eggman and it's off to Hilltop Zone. Hilltop Zone is a concept left over from the original Sonic 2 time travel idea, which is why we see enemies like dinosaurs. As the name implies, there's a lot more verticality to this stage than the previous ones. It's not that levels didn't have multiple layers before, but this level features several vertical cliffs players will need to make it above, and then steep drops, often supplemented with a lift platform that will safely take players back down. So this stage really comes across, to me, as the team's way to try and see what they can do with as much verticality in one stage. It's similar to how Eggman's stage in Mega Man 1 or Crash Man's stage in Mega Man 2 are these giant vertical climbs. Even though players will be familiar with the game and its mechanics by now, as this is stage 5, Hilltop Zone once again utilizes a whole new set of tools not yet seen in Sonic 2. So, to that end, smartly, the team introduces pretty much all of this right off the bat in Act 1. Players are safely shown one of the dropping platforms. Well, I mean, mostly safely shown this. There's a giant death pit below, and Tails screwed me over at least once. Immediately afterwards is this enemy with a giant spike on his head players will need to roll to destroy, or wait for the spike to shoot off. Either way, an enemy who begs for caution. Next, we're introduced to lava, and then one of these teeter-totters. These teeter-totters are actually something originally from Starlight Zone in Sonic 1, but as they're good tools for vertical traversal with an enemy, but also fun spring mechanic, there's no reason not to bring this back for this stage that's all about verticality. Technically, the team could have put a spring here and called it a day, but this teeter-totter is definitely the more interesting obstacle, so long as it's not overused throughout the entirety of the game. After the teeter-totter is a spinning drop, which is another tool that was used in Sonic 1, which players would have first seen in Green Hill Zone. It's visually a fun way to travel down, and in Hilltop Zone, it's always paired with a ramp immediately afterwards. So, while it does add to this vertical feel of the stage, both in dropping and climbing, it forces players into shooting off of and interacting with these ramps. By using these properly, players can find alternate routes, so definitely a fun way to reuse this asset from Sonic 1. Another fun tool used in this stage is this ground Sonic can smash through while spinning. While we saw this before, again in Sonic 1, and in particular during Marble Zone, this time around it's usually utilized right after a loop. This creates another unique way for Sonic to travel down and, once again, play off that verticality of this stage. The final main challenge we see in Hilltop Zone is yet another one involving the climbing vertical challenges of the overall stage. There are multiple sections that lock Sonic in, where the ground will start rising from below with this sort of reverse cave-in. Typically, this ground is the only way for Sonic to reach his next destination, but it comes with the drawback that if players linger too long, they'll become trapped and get smashed. There's also a section where the ground is instead lava. These sections create these nice moments that actually force players to play quickly, or die. While Sonic is a game that's about speed, it's pretty rare for that speed to actually be necessary, so it's nice to see these moments. I also think it's a fun take on the scrolling screen concept. By this point, various games had played with the concept of a constantly scrolling screen, adding a layer of intensity as players are forced to platform at the speed of the screen scroll. So, in a way, this is a little bit like a screen scroll, but with more leeway. Players can still move freely outside of the bounds of the cave-in, cave-up, but they're still forced into the timing of the segments, making for a more forgiving version of a screen scroll. Overall, this is actually one of my personal favorite stages in Sonic 2. The stage does a great job of including interesting routes for traversing up or down, with a lot of the downward sections allowing players to create their own route if they want to be a little more unsafe. There's interesting obstacles, but still moments for the player to go fast and really utilize their spin dash. In general, I like when games succeed in vertical traversal, and I think Hilltop Zone is Sonic 2's success at doing exactly that. I also happen to like the music and overall aesthetic of this stage, so I'm sure that helps too. Speaking on the art, I always like to talk briefly about the art and music at some point, so being that I enjoy the aesthetic of Hilltop Zone, this seems like a good point to stop and talk about that. Like Sonic 1, the art of Sonic 2 is vibrant and still looks great. Sonic is such a strong design that Sonic's sprite saw minimal changes here, with only the shade of blue on his sprite changing. But there is a little more to discuss, and really, the biggest changes I see are in the backgrounds and tile maps. To start, with Sonic 1, Naoto Oshima was the lead artist, but notably not the only artist on the team. However, to my understanding, he did create the concept art for the various zones. Naoto Oshima wouldn't end up working on Sonic 2, instead remaining in Japan and eventually working on Sonic CD. I find that particularly interesting here, because from a visual standpoint, I think Sonic CD is more akin to Sonic 1 than Sonic 2 is. Something particularly notable in the tile maps of Sonic 1 are patterns, the checkered pattern of Green Hill Zone being particularly iconic and notable. But this wasn't only a Green Hill Zone thing. Looking at Marble Zone, the tile map platforms consist of these bricks. In Spring Yard Zone, you see these various circles throughout the tiles. Starlight Zone has a bolt pattern with steel plates bolted together, and then Scrap Brain Zone and Labyrinth Zone have a little less in terms of patterns, but have giant blocks for their tiles. Sonic CD pretty notably continues this idea. The first stage, Palm Tree Panic, which is kind of like Sonic CD's Green Hill Zone, has this triangle pattern throughout the tiles, somewhat resembling the checker pattern of Green Hill Zone. While this is the most apparent in Green Hill Zone compared to Palm Tree Panic, it's a theme you can see throughout Sonic CD. Collision Chaos has this wave pattern in its tile set, Tidal Tempest has these brainy lines as well as giant circles, Quartz Quadrant then has triangles and checker patterns everywhere. Now, let's look at Sonic 2. In Emerald Hill Zone, there's a little bit of a checker pattern here and there to tie this stage thematically to Green Hill Zone, but it's much more restrained. Hilltop Zone repeats this concept, but with a different color, likely due to that whole initial time travel idea. Chemical Plant Zone has some metal plates with bolts, but it's far more broken up with a lot more detail and different types of tiles. Aquatic Ruin Zone, for my money, looks gorgeous, in part because it's not so reliant on these specific shaped patterns, but instead uses contrasting colors and shapes to create an interesting tile set. And this is how I feel about the tile sets throughout Sonic 2. Look at Mystic Cave Zone. There's this great rocky surface the team put in that feels like a dynamic rock pattern, rather than some video gamey patterned surface. Now, to be fair, Sonic 2's team was massive compared to Sonic 1, incorporating both American and Japanese artists. So there are far more resources at play here, and I think it shows, not only in the tile sets, but also in the stage backgrounds. While Sonic 2 continues the cool tradition of having a huge number of parallax backgrounds to help sell Sonic's speed in certain stages, not every stage opts for this. Chemical Plant Zone incorporates various wired meshes at different places in the background, which are still parallax scrolling, but more interesting as they don't feel like a traditional background as they're these separated pillars. It then adds extra animations to really bring out that factory feel. Casino Night Zone has neon lights blinking in different colors, once again, really utilizing animation to help sell the feel of the stage. While I love Green Hill Zone, it's classic, it's gorgeous, it's unique, and it has this stunning animated background with multiple parallax layers. Overall, I really do think Sonic 2 has a much stronger background and tile art style to Sonic 1 and Sonic CD. The tile sets and backgrounds have much more going on in Sonic 2 than Sonic 1, again, likely thanks to the larger team, which helps make these areas look particularly nice. But to compare it to Sonic CD, while there are some really nice backgrounds in CD, I honestly think the geometric shapes are overdone, with it almost clashing at times. On top of that, I think some of the Sonic CD backgrounds look a little flat, whereas I think you can better see that sense of depth in the Sonic 2 backgrounds. Now, I'm no expert when it comes to this sort of visual design, but if I had to guess, it probably has something to do with a combination of the size of each parallax layer combined with the color and contrast of each one. While I think Sonic 2's art is an overall upgrade to Sonic 2, that's no different to my personal tastes when it comes to the music of Sonic 2. With Sonic 1, I can quickly lay out for you my favorite tracks: Sonic's theme, Green Hill Zone, and Marble Zone. I also like Scrap Brain Zone and Labyrinth Zone, although not as much as those first three. But while I enjoy those tracks, I love most of the soundtrack to Sonic 2. Chemical Plant Zone and Metropolis Zone are absolute bangers. Hilltop Zone is fun, and Emerald Hill Zone, while not as strong to me as Green Hill Zone, is another great introductory track. Aquatic Ruin Zone is super cool sounding to me, and both the single-player version of Mystic Cave Zone and especially the multiplayer version are awesome. But outside of me just gushing about how much I like this soundtrack, the background to it is pretty interesting. Masato Nakamura of the J-pop band Dreams Come True composed the soundtracks to both Sonic 1 and Sonic 2. Although, to my understanding, after Sonic 1 was released, Dreams Come True became even more popular than before. As that was the case, Nakamura demanded much more money for Sonic 2, and Sega was hesitant to pay it. According to the development video I recommended, The Definitive Development History of Sonic the Hedgehog 2 by GameFAQs Special, Sega actually tried to use an in-house composer instead because the asking fee was too much. But apparently, after Sonic Team heard the tracks, they begged Sega to go with Nakamura because the tracks were such poor quality. It's fair to say there's also a chance that they used temp music, and that was always the plan until they found their ultimate composer, but I'm honestly not sure. There's a rumor I've seen that one of these lost tracks was Nightclub Scene by David Javalosa, apologies if I'm mispronouncing that, which you can briefly hear here. But I don't think this was ever actually meant for Sonic 2. To my understanding from reading his responses and looking at his other music, this was part of a demo reel that David put together, where he imagined this as a track for Sonic 2. It was meant to familiarize himself with the hardware used to make Sega Genesis music, and was just that, a demo reel, with this one particular track inspired by Sonic 2. So, if that story of the original Sonic 2 music is true, I don't know if we'll ever hear it, although I would definitely be curious. For coming to the end of Hilltop Zone, players will reach the Egg Scorcher Mark II. This is aptly named as the original Egg Scorcher was the boss of Marble Zone in Sonic 1. So let's compare them. The Egg Scorcher boss battle takes place in an arena with the pit of lava over the center of the stage. Fireballs will spring out of it, making it more difficult for Sonic to jump across. Robotnik in his Egg Scorcher will fly back and forth across the screen, dropping fireballs on the platforms. When he does, they'll spread out across the platform, temporarily making that platform dangerous for Sonic to be on, meaning Sonic will need to leap across to continue attacking Robotnik from below. The Egg Scorcher Mark II Battle of Hilltop Zone also takes place in an arena with lava. However, this time there are two lava pits, with one on each side of the screen and disjointed platforms. Robotnik will now rise up from one of the lava pits and shoot a burst of lava projectile straight across the screen. Afterwards, he'll return to the lava, and when he does, lava balls will pop out, engulfing the two platforms on either side of the lava pit. So they're somewhat similar in that they both involve lava, and there's an attack that engulfs the ground. But mechanically, they're fairly different. The Mark II, I suppose, is slightly harder to hit in the sense that there's lava underneath, and players need to be careful bouncing on him, otherwise they can fall below to get injured. Or, Tails can accidentally cause this to happen, as if Tails hits the Mark II, its iframes will activate and Sonic will fall through. But I think the original Egg Scorcher is a more challenging fight, and really asks more of the player. In that scenario, players are forced to do a dangerous hop to avoid getting hit by lava balls. One of the platforms they're on will get engulfed by lava, so it's inevitable. On top of that, hitting Robotnik from below, I think, is slightly more challenging than simply bouncing on him. It's also easy enough to avoid all of the Egg Scorcher Mark II's attacks here. For his projectile, either jump over or bounce on him. With the lava balls, as long as you're on the center platform, all you need to do is jump onto whichever platform of the two is further from the lava Robotnik is descending into, and you'll be safe. I've always thought this fight was fine, it's simple but enjoyable enough, and it's fun as Super Sonic to just obliterate him by bouncing inside of him. But I do think the original Egg Scorcher is probably a more interesting boss fight to me. It feels slightly more dangerous, forcing the player to be a little more proactive, so I think I prefer that one of the two. For defeating the Egg Scorcher Mark II, players will reach Mystic Cave Zone. Mystic Cave Zone is the obstacle-heavy maze course of Sonic 2. It's filled with spike traps, spiked columns that come out players will need to jump on in time, moving platforms, smashing walls, moving boxes that can crush players if they're in the wrong spot, swinging spiked balls, collapsing bridges, and plenty of bridges and paths that will only become accessible if players jump onto a special lever. On top of that, the route forward isn't always clear, with plenty of walls blocking players from going directly left to right. To that end, it's definitely one of the slower stages of Sonic 2, as not only will players not have a clear way to get to where they need to go, but they'll regularly have a slew of obstacles in their way. I imagine reception of this stage is a little mixed, as this stage has the most starting and stopping of any of the stages so far. To that end, it reminds me a little bit of Marble Zone from Sonic 1 in its design philosophy. However, unlike Marble Zone, Mystic Cave Zone does still maintain the idea of having multiple routes, which has now become a staple in Sonic 2. Similar to Hilltop Zone, Mystic Cave Zone introduces some of its new ideas immediately, giving players a broad sense of what this stage will be like. In fact, the very first obstacle is a set of collapsing bridges. Immediately, we're shown that there will be traps. From there, things change depending on the route you take. Speaking on traps, while I wasn't a big fan of the spikes coming in and out of the ground in Emerald Hill Zone, I do like how they're handled here in Mystic Cave Zone a little more. Not only is this stage about obstacles and traps, so players should immediately be on the lookout for this sort of thing, but they're typically utilized in spots where the player has a moment to look around anyways. Take this section in Act 1, where players are forced to be lowered through a bridge by a vine. While players can immediately jump off, I think most would probably assess where to go for a moment, and if you take that moment, it should be long enough for the spikes to pop out, giving players a fair warning. Another trap I particularly like in this stage are these spiked platforms that come out of walls, creating a staircase for Sonic to time out and jump on. It's a unique obstacle that isn't overly difficult, but still gives players something to watch out for while forcing them to time out these jumps. Something pretty notorious to this stage is this trap drop, which in the original game drops players into an inescapable bed of spikes. In Sonic Origins, which is what I'm playing on, this leads players to the brand new Hidden Palace Zone, which is what I'm showing as I don't have footage this far into the original game, but you get the idea. It's an inescapable bed of spikes. I actually like this trap a lot, in particular, because it's a one-off. I mean, really, it's practically the same thing as a death pit. It's something I wouldn't generally mind, but there is the fact that with a bed of spikes, if Sonic is trapped and in Supersonic mode, it means players will have to wait for Supersonic to run out before they can finally die and restart the level. So, because of that annoyance, it's not something that should be overused. And it isn't, as it's only used here. And like I said, I think it's a fun trap because it's different. While Mystic Cave Zone has quite a bit of starting and stopping, I don't think that's a bad thing, and to me, it shows off that Sonic's mechanics work and feel fun regardless of what speed he's going at. If the whole game were like Mystic Cave Zone, it would be a shame. But as a one-off stage, I think this one is fitting with a nice variety of different obstacles for players to tackle that has its own unique feel. Reach the end of Mystic Cave Zone, and Sonic will square off against Robotnik in his Egg Digger. The Egg Digger will dig out of the ceiling, causing dangerous stalactites to fall, which players will need to avoid. Afterwards, he'll slowly come down from the ceiling, move his drills forward, attack forwards, and then slowly return to the ceiling. It's not too challenging, especially if you have rings, as you can lay into him, even if you get hit, by just using your iframes. But I do have a couple of qualms with this fight in particular. In theory, I think this boss battle is completely fine. But here's where I have issues. The stalactites falling from the ceiling is a good concept, and I like the idea of needing to suddenly dodge and avoid obstacles. But I think the ceiling, and therefore obstacles, might be slightly too close to the ground. Players will have just enough time to react and avoid them, which to me doesn't feel great because of Sonic's slow acceleration. It feels like you're just barely avoiding the stalactites and just have enough time, which is okay, but I think slightly more time would have felt a little better. The other issue I have is that it's not entirely clear where Robotnik's attack box is. Visually, when he's coming down from the ceiling, or back up into the ceiling, it looks like you should be able to hit his side, as his drill is pointing straight up, and there are flames coming from the bottom of his flying saucer, making it visually look like hitting directly below him is unsafe. However, it seems like below him is the safe place to hit, even though you see a flame, and his sides are still dangerous even with the drills facing up. So, to me at least, the visuals don't really match the danger zone and hitboxes of this particular boss. Defeat the Egg Digger, and it's off to Oil Ocean Zone. In some ways, Oil Ocean Zone's design reminds me of Chemical Plant Zone. You'll climb up, then take some sort of ramp back down, and there's transporters that shoot you to different parts of the stage. But whereas Chemical Plant Zone had giant ramps Sonic would run down, Oil Ocean Zone uses this oil that Sonic will instead forcibly slide down, unless players jump. Instead of transporter pipes Sonic will spin through that take players to new sections of the stage, Oil Ocean Zone uses these giant barrels that shoot Sonic across the screen to new sections. All of this is set over a sea of oil, as the name of the stage implies. The oil acts similar to how quicksand might in other games, with players slowly sinking and then dying once they hit a certain threshold, although it's easy enough to jump out before that point. When I say this stage is kinda like Chemical Plant Zone, that's really it. I meant in terms of general layout. There are more obstacles in Oil Ocean Zone that both help to set it apart and also slows down the stage a little bit. There are these pressurized caps players will need to jump onto at the right time, which will pop them up for traversing new areas. Additionally, there are fans that act incredibly similar to the fans of Starlight Zone, which will turn on and off, and when they're on, force players in a certain direction. Sometimes this is pushing them away from where they need to go, and other times it could help players float across a gap. Another obstacle I like here are these spikes that travel back and forth across a platform. It's not particularly challenging, and I honestly think Sonic 1 did this better with its rotating spiked log, but it's still a decent enough obstacle to slow down players. I think the only unique addition to this stage I don't like are these elevators. Like any elevator, players hop on and it will take them up or down to a new level. Sometimes this is mixed with an enemy, but that's pretty rare. So what it results in is, honestly, a pretty uninteresting way to travel. We've seen springs, we've seen teeter-totters acting like springs, ramps players can spin dash up, and even general platforming, which is all more interesting than running onto an object, sitting, and waiting for it. I suppose there are two arguments for these elevators. One is that you could argue that, hey, we've seen all of those other obstacles before, and this is something different, so that alone warrants its inclusion. The other is that these elevators can hide routes, where a player could take the elevator up, but then hop off and go down the opening it creates. The latter of these is the more interesting argument to me, and I think in another game, that alone would be a great justification. It's something that would and has worked great in a Metroidvania game like Hollow Knight or Silksong that's all about exploration. But in a 2D action side-scroller like Sonic, I find these elevators to be less interesting methods of traversal than we've seen throughout the rest of the game, and less fun. One of the more interesting spots in Oil Ocean Zone, to me, is this part in Act 2 where players will shoot from pressurized ball to pressurized ball until they end up near an oil fall. While sometimes running and jumping up these can lead to special routes, here it's clearly the wrong direction as marked by an elevator. So if players travel to the left, which is the actual correct direction, the upwards path will take them to the boss. But should players fall, they'll need to travel to the right beyond the oil ocean and up pressurized plates until they come right back to the top of that same oil spill ramp from before. It's notable to me because I think these sorts of falls with time sink losses are pretty rare in Sonic 2, and it's actually kinda nice that the team includes a real penalty for messing up here. Granted, with all of the alternate routes, sometimes it's difficult to tell if you were traveling somewhere new and the correct way, or on a bad route. I mean, take this exact example. While players can take a bottom route that will lead to the pressurized plates, if players use the shooting ball sequence to get here, they won't have seen the bottom route and have no idea that they just backtracked by falling down here. When it first happened to me, I thought I was traveling the correct direction now, and to the boss, completely unaware of what I'd done. Some might view this as a bad thing because the player could be lost without realizing it, and the direction to go wasn't entirely clear. But you did fall down, so, it's not entirely out of the question to make this a true mistake. Nothing about this stage is bad, but for some reason I've honestly never particularly liked Oil Ocean Zone, and it's a level I always forget exists until I get back to it, and I'm trying to determine why exactly that is for me. I think the most interesting obstacle here is the pressure plates that shoot up, and there are some good instances of using these for unique challenges, but maybe if they'd been utilized a little more, this stage would have stood out to me. That's similar to the oil that Sonic will slide down. It's primarily used as a traversal mechanic to get Sonic from point A to point B, but it never struck me as the most interesting way to do this. I think of Hilltop Zone, where there's this moving platform that players can take which is safe, or jump off of, which then creates a much more dangerous but faster route, as immediately being more interesting, as it gives players more choice and the chance to go fast if they so choose. While there's instances like this, other obstacles just aren't my favorite. Take these fans. The ones that keep the player floating up and then turn off are unique, and I like that they require players to think a little bit and actually require a bit of proper timing. But then there's the ones that blow towards the player and stop them from progressing until they turn off. You could argue that these horizontal ones are tools to teach players how the fans work, but they also impede the player progressing with no actual challenge. It's just a moment of waiting for the timer on the fan to turn off with nothing else players can do. I think there's a way these could have been made more interesting though. Say you place some super difficult obstacle right afterwards, so if players are going at max speed, they're very likely to imperil themselves, meaning players should be managing their speed during the fan sequence in order to not accidentally shoot forwards too quickly when the fan turns off. That, to me, is more interesting, because now it's a true obstacle with an intent behind it. To be fair, I might be a little biased here, because something about the aesthetic and music of this stage never gelled with me subjectively. But while I don't think this is a great stage, I also don't think it's bad, per se. I just consider it to be on the lower rung of Sonic 2 stages. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Make it through Oil Ocean Zone, and players will reach Robotnik in his Eggmarine. The Eggmarine will cycle between raising out of the oil, giving players an opportunity to hit it, and diving back in, then performing one of two attacks. Either it will shoot out a spiked centipede-like arm that players will need to jump over, or an arm with a laser on it will come out of the oil, shooting lasers at Sonic. If the laser is low, it will create flames across the platform Sonic is standing on. In a lot of ways, this feels like a more advanced version of the Egg Scorcher Mark II. The vehicle rises and dives back into whatever the ground is, has some sort of projectile attack, and can set the ground on fire. This one is more challenging though, as players can't rapidly destroy it, and will have to actually deal with the obstacles while Robotnik is hiding under the oil. On top of that, these obstacles are quicker and more difficult to avoid, with the laser arm shooting multiple lasers at random times and heights before it finally recedes back into the oil. So, to that end, it's a fantastic build-up to what we'd seen before. The players are now 2 stages beyond where they'd seen the Egg Scorcher Mark II, so a great way to utilize that same challenge leveled up. For defeating the Eggmarine, players will make it to Metropolis Zone, and some of my favorite music in Sonic 2. As we're near the end, Metropolis Zone ramps up the difficulty with a plethora of far more challenging obstacles than we'd seen before. It's also unique in that, while all of the stages up to this point had 2 acts, Metropolis Zone instead has 3. So, what makes Metropolis Zone so tough? Well, for one, the stage finally has enemies that are actually dangerous and can be genuinely challenging to defeat without making a mistake and getting hit. There are frequently Asterons who will explode shooting spikes in the 5 corners of its star shape. These ones are frequently conveniently, or inconveniently, placed around the giant screws and bolts Sonic will be running up vertically, making for challenging obstacles players will need to avoid in the middle of a vertical climb, with their projectiles knocking Sonic off. Shell crackers often block tight corridors and have a giant spiked arm that protects its side. When Sonic is close, it'll extend out this arm attempting to attack him, and at the same time, all of this prevents players from rolling into it. So, players will need to be careful and jump onto its head to destroy it. Finally, the enemy I find to be the largest obstacle are these slicers. Slicers are mantises who toss out their arms which will home in on the player. While this leaves them defenseless, the most challenging aspect to them is frequently in their placement and how difficult it can be to avoid their attack. Act 3 has a particularly difficult sequence involving the slicers and Asterons, where players will need to climb a series of giant screws, all while avoiding exploding Asterons, before reaching a ledge with the slicer, who can very easily use its claws to home in on the player and knock them right back down to the bottom of the climb, or kill them if they've run out of rings. While some of these placements might feel a bit unfair, this one in particular, considering this is the second to last stage, I think it's a fitting escalation in the difficulty. While the enemies are tougher here, as with any good Sonic stage, what really sets Metropolis Zone apart are the obstacles. Probably the most abundant and obvious obstacle are the aforementioned giant bolts and nuts, which will require players to run on the nut in the correct direction in order to raise or lower it. The team definitely went all in seeing how they could use these to hinder players. If players are climbing up these, they could be safe, they could have spikes at the top, they could have enemies players will need to avoid by stopping or running in the reverse direction, and there are ledges with other enemies players will need to avoid. Additionally, players can accidentally smash themselves, so they'll always have to be a little cautious. The bolts and nuts are also used for traveling downwards, and to try and ensure players actually use them, spikes are oftentimes placed at the bottom, although I still like to skip them anyways. While I do think this is a great obstacle, because it can take some time to make progress, I honestly think they might have been used a little too much. At a certain point, it feels like challenges are repeating, and that doesn't make the obstacle any more interesting than it was before. We have a return of the pressurized place from Oil Ocean Zone, this time as pistons. They behave the same, but this time, the pressurized gas from the side can injure players, making these a little more interesting than before. Another new obstacle are these boxes with spears that pop out of the sides, with the spears rotating clockwise. It's a cool obstacle that requires some thought and timing, and unlike the nuts and bolts, this is one I think actually could have been utilized a little more, as it's a nice bit of precision platforming mixed with timing. Giant rotating gears are a nice touch with the mechanical visuals of the stage, and we'll see Sonic needing to rotate along with them to gain ground. Although, if I'm being honest, I think they're a slightly less interesting version of the similar rotating discs from Scrap Brain Zone, which saw players needing to run around them and shoot off at the correct time. And speaking of comparisons to Sonic 1, another obstacle that's similar to something we saw in Scrap Brain Zone are these timed smashing pistons. We see something incredibly similar in Scrap Brain Zone, with blocks that pop down attempting to smash the player. As far as comparisons to Sonic 1 go, Metropolis Zone is very much Sonic 2's version of Scrap Brain Zone. But while they're both challenging in different ways, I think it's better designed and includes obstacles that feel a little more fair, although I suppose you could argue that makes Scrap Brain Zone a more challenging stage, for better or worse. When I make that comparison, I'm pretty specifically thinking about these smashing pistons and how they're handled in Sonic 1 versus Sonic 2. In Sonic 1, these pistons were seen on a moving tread that moves Sonic in one direction, really making the challenge far more difficult, especially trying to play off of this combined with Sonic's acceleration factor. However, in Sonic 2, gone are the treads. Usually, granted this time around, players can run on top of the smashing piston instead of the tread, immediately making this obstacle easier to navigate. Additionally, Sonic now has his spin dash, which will instantly accelerate him and makes this obstacle feel a lot more fair to deal with. More obstacles include bumpers on the sides of walls, giving Sonic a new interesting way to traverse vertically. These cool wow factor spinning grates, which really feel like more of a way to reuse the visual asset of Sonic running around a corkscrew, but are still a nice touch that feels unique, with the team going all out to make this appear 3D in a 2D game. There's also lava, plenty of spikes, moving platforms, and bridges that can be toggled on and off. Although one thing notably absent from this stage are instant death pits. But even still, this stage can be pretty challenging, especially compared to the stages up to this point. So I think it's actually pretty cool that the team was able to make Metropolis Zone feel challenging in its own unique way without resorting to any sort of insta-death. Not that there's anything wrong with insta-death traps, by the way. It's just something that stands out to me here and helps set apart why Metropolis Zone is difficult compared to Scrap Brain Zone of Sonic 1 or the upcoming Winged Fortress Zone, where insta-death pits account for a large part of the challenge. While there are challenges to Metropolis Zone and a lot of reasons for players to want to play more cautiously, the Spin Dash allows Metropolis Zone to still let players feel fast. There are several sections with large ramps players will need enough speed to climb up, giving the perfect opportunity for the Spin Dash to shine and showcase how it can be a great tool for vertical traversal. I also especially like these 180-degree ramps that will see players run along the wall and end up directly above where they were before. These are the sorts of things that help make Sonic still feel cool, even when needing to frequently slow down. Overall, I think Metropolis Zone is a great near-final stage. It's a leveled up challenge, has multiple routes for players to take, and still maintains just enough balance in slow, cautious obstacles and cool, quick moments to make for a fun stage. My only real critique here is the giant bolts being perhaps a little too abundant, especially since these are really the slowest feeling moments in the stage. Additionally, with Metropolis Zone being 3 acts while all the other stages were only 2 acts up to this point, for me at least, it does start to overstay its welcome a little bit by the end. It's ironic because all of the stages in Sonic 1 had 3 acts, but I like this change up to a 2-act structure that Sonic 2 utilizes, as the change in music, scenery, and obstacle variation I think helps keep the game continually feel exciting and fresh. Complete Metropolis Zone and players will reach Robotnik in his Egg Bouncer. Like how Metropolis Zone is much more challenging than the stages we'd seen before, the Egg Bouncer is far more challenging than the previous bosses. At least in the way that I've always fought him. This time around, Robotnik has pods spinning and orbiting around him, acting as a shield. He'll descend towards the center of the stage, move back and forth, then return to the center of the screen and force his eggs into a far wider orbit. After this, they'll spin horizontally around him, creating an easy space to hit him. Once Sonic does hit him, an egg pod will pop off, turning into a mini Eggman players can destroy, making it so Robotnik has one less shield. Once Robotnik is out of egg pods, he'll travel up and down the screen shooting lasers at Sonic, although now only takes one more hit to destroy. Now, something you might have noticed is that the footage I used for the Egg Bouncer traveling back and forth across the screen is from the YouTuber Emerald Player 2989. The reason for that is, I actually never knew he had this pattern, until just now as I decided to look up the standard strategy for the Egg Bouncer. As far as I was always concerned, his egg pods rotate in a pattern where they'll leave one spot vulnerable. This spot moves as the egg pods rotate and can be difficult to properly spot when there's a lot of them. However, as Robotnik loses his shields, these become easier and easier to hit. You can also hit him at any point by getting hurt yourself, then iframing through that to hurt him, which is the other thing I'd resort to if I messed up and didn't properly hit his weak spot. It's a gamble as you'll lose rings, but you'll still be able to knock out one of his pods, making the fight a little easier for yourself. So, unbeknownst to me, I'd actually always been fighting the Egg Bouncer the more challenging but quicker way, which is actually pretty cool. If players are patient, there's this drastically easier pattern Robotnik will use that's recognizable and easier to avoid. It also means that players who want to take a risk and gamble, or better players, can fight Robotnik this much more challenging way and be rewarded with a quicker fight. It's kinda like the reverse of how Catcher Eggman from Casino Night Zone works, where the more advanced method for defeating him is actually the easier method. So I think this version, where the more advanced method is the more challenging version, makes more sense, and I really like the boss for having these two distinct methods for defeating him. Even before I knew this though, I always enjoyed this fight for the timing challenge that I thought it was. Defeat the Egg Bouncer, and players will make it to Sky Chase Zone, the shmup level of Sonic 2. Okay, maybe not a shmup, but I mean, it kinda is like what Sonic would be like as a shmup in a funny sort of way. Sky Chase Zone is an auto-scroller that consists of a few basic shmup enemies. You have your basic enemies who just fly right across the screen, a horizontal projectile enemy in these flying turtles, and an enemy who drops bombs when they're above the player. And that's really it. While this level can be potentially a little tricky if you don't know the best place to position yourself for some of these enemies, it's really pretty simple and a bit more of a break stage. It is interesting in a way, because even though it has shmup elements, it still incorporates platforming elements too, with Sonic being able to jump on top of the turtles and platform off of them. It does make me think there might have been a more interesting version of this stage, where Sonic sometimes deals with enemies using his basic moveset, while other times has to platform off of enemies dealing with this auto-scroller. But as it stands, the stage serves as a fine breather between two far more challenging stages. And really, I think that's all it was meant to be, with a fun visual element of Tails flying Sonic to Robotnik's Wing Fortress in a stage rather than a direct cutscene. Wing Fortress Zone takes the fun concept of having a platform stage outside of a flying plane. What that results in is not only the obvious idea of a constant insta-death pit if players fall off the plane, but also fun ideas like this one, where Sonic will fly backwards along the side of the plane, grasping onto handles before they break. Sonic mostly platforms along the outside or top of the ship, but will occasionally briefly run inside to access a new area, which is a nice touch. This is the final platform stage, and as such, it's the final test. Sort of. It's actually pretty easy to skip every single difficult portion of this stage and avoid the bottom portion entirely, especially if you have Super Sonic, where you can pretty easily leap above every large wall that might be blocking you. Although I'd equate that to more of a fun secret for advanced players than necessarily the stage as it's intended. As it's intended, this stage has a nice mix of challenges mostly around the idea of avoiding falling to your instant doom. This includes a plethora of moving platforms, bars Sonic will hang onto and have to jump off of in time with said moving platforms, and timed platforms where Sonic will have to quickly leap across, otherwise they'll flip away, dropping Sonic into the abyss. While these sections are challenging thanks to the major stakes of instant death, it's notable then that the team very specifically decided not to include any enemies during these more challenging sequences so players could focus solely on the platforming. While I think enemies would make sense during these portions in just about any other game, as I've mentioned a few times, Sonic is decidedly not a game about enemies, and much more about platforming and obstacle challenges. So not only would it feel out of place for enemies to be positioned here during these sequences, it would also probably feel unfair. Most of the enemies in Sonic are really meant as obstacles for players to accidentally run into and lose rings, while also knocking them back pretty significantly. So having a number of enemies here with the sole purpose of knocking players back into an instant death pit during a precarious platforming sequence where players are asked to go slow instead of utilizing Sonic's normal speed would probably be a bit much. Another obstacle used here are these, well, I don't know what exactly they are, but treads that shoot Sonic forwards. It's another way to do a spring or bumper, but as they also lift Sonic into the air, the team included a fun little bit at the bottom of the Wing Fortress where these will rocket Sonic back and forth over a giant gap. While one will take you the correct direction, immediately afterwards is one that will rocket you the wrong way, which to me is a pretty funny gag that will probably immediately freak out unaware players. While it's not new and we've seen troll moments like this before, this one particularly stands out to me, and I like this occasional sense of humor in the design. Nothing else about Wing Fortress Zone is too challenging. There are some minor platforming challenges with platforms that flip between vertical and horizontal, and some simple enemies, but really, the entire bulk of the actual challenge lies at the bottom of the stage. If you're progressing through the stage normally, the stage is pretty well balanced between the more challenging platforming at the bottom of the ship and easier portions where players can really go fast and get that Sonic feel at the top of the plane. There's an argument to be had that more of the stage should have been these harrowing obstacles with instant death challenges, or things like wind blowing Sonic back along the side of the plane. It's an argument I'm making up, by the way, but playing off the idea of the final stage being the ultimate challenge of a game, and that's really going to depend on your personal tastes. I think for most games, not all, it's best to balance difficult portions of stages with moments of relief. It's okay to have every obstacle be stressful, but then you're making a sort of ultimate challenge that I think is usually better relegated to secret or optional areas. Think the Path of Pain in Hollow Knight. So when you're not doing that, yes, you want to present some particularly challenging moments for the player, especially here at the final stage, but then you give moments of a bit of respite to celebrate their success in completing a difficult challenge and also recover. It's like when you listen to a good song and how it might build up to a chorus or major moment and then switch to something not quite as intense. All of that said, I feel like Wing Fortress Zone is balanced pretty 50-50 in terms of the difficult portions and easier portions, if not weighted more towards easier sections where players don't have to worry about falling to their doom. And for some players, tilting this a little further to the difficult challenges might have been a better weight here, especially considering you can technically skip every single tough portion of the stage. But as far as making this game something with a broader appeal, I think Wing Fortress Zone manages to find a good balance within its difficulty. Make it through Robotnik's Wing Fortress and you'll reach the Laser Prison. Here, two lasers will block Sonic into a boss fight where a giant shelled laser at the top of the room will move back and forth. After a while, the shell will retract, revealing the laser as it charges, and then it will shoot a giant beam downwards from its position players will need to avoid. To add to this challenge, Sonic can't immediately jump to hit the laser, but instead will need to jump on one of 3 spiked platforms that will also be in the arena bouncing around. As the bottom of these are spiked, they not only help Sonic, but hinder him. This, to me, feels like the perfect type of boss for a Sonic game. The reason I say that is that while Sonic is attacking the laser and avoiding it, a lot of this fight is also about minute platforming, which really feels more in line with what Sonic's gameplay is actually about rather than battles. This fight can certainly be challenging, with a lot players will need to avoid, but is fitting for what's almost the end of the game. After destroying the laser prison, Sonic will chase Robotnik out and with the help of Tails, land onto his rocket ship, taking Sonic into outer space and to the Death Star. Death Egg. So, with that, players will be in outer space at the start of the final stage, Death Egg Zone. This zone is really just a sequence of 2 boss battles with no rings, so let's dive in. The first of these fights is against Mecha Sonic. I honestly always thought this was Metal Sonic as a kid, like a prototype version of it, especially since I didn't own Sonic's CD, but no, it's Mecha Sonic. At its metal core, Mecha Sonic is a memorization fight. What that means is, it's incredibly difficult, to my opinion, to beat this boss on your first go, second go, or even third go. His attacks are quick, and unless you know what he's going to do, they are incredibly difficult to avoid. And as Sonic has 0 rings in this boss fight, that means you have no room to make any mistakes. But Mecha Sonic will repeat this same pattern no matter what, every single time you fight him, hence a boss memorization fight. On my personal tier list of boss fights I enjoy, this type of fight is honestly on my lower rung. It doesn't feel like you're reacting or playing well, it's just a matter of doing this fight enough times that you understand what he's going to do, and then from there, it becomes more repetitive than fun, at least to me. And I'm talking about these types of fights in general, not just Mecha Sonic. As far as Mecha Sonic specifically goes, he's a copy of Sonic and is vulnerable while he's standing. But, as he's a copy of Sonic, that means that he has dangerous spikes on his back, so if players touch those, that's a death. Similarly, he'll crouch into a ball, just like Sonic, and spin forwards, with all of this being an instant death if he touches Sonic, as he has those Sonic spikes. If you're playing cautiously, which means attacking him one time, safely per one of his attacks, his pattern is as follows. Spin roll across the screen at Sonic. Fly back and forth across the screen while crouched, meaning players can actually spin dash into him or jump into him during this sequence. Spin jump across the screen. Spin roll across the screen, spin roll across the screen, spin jump across the screen, but now he shoots out spikes in the middle of his jump, etc., etc. As I said, the slow strategy is to play it safe and only attack once per sequence. But the thing that does make Mecha Sonic a little more fun, even for a boss memorization fight, is that there are plenty of points to sneak in more hits on him. By bouncing on him, I was able to reliably get 3 hits in per one of his attacks. When he does his flying back and forth across the screen, you can spin dash through him. There's also a technique I've seen speedrunners use where you can repeatedly spin dash inside of him, which will protect you and activate his iframes, making it so he doesn't hurt you. Overall, Mecha Sonic isn't too difficult, and I honestly think the biggest issue with this fight is that it can be a time sink, especially if you're not aware of the faster ways to kill it. On top of that, the fight afterwards is far more challenging, and if you mess up, it's right back to the time sink of Mecha Sonic. So it's good then that there are these quicker methods to defeat him, and I think the fact players can find these methods makes the fight feel much more fun, but I still don't love the memorization aspect to this fight. Every boss fight is going to have an element of memorization and pattern recognition, but when it's the same exact pattern every single time, and when if you don't know that pattern, it's likely going to result in a death, it really does make this type of fight feel like you're simply memorizing a sequence rather than necessarily playing well. One more aspect to this fight I want to mention is that I really like the detail of Robotnik watching the fight through a slit in the wall. Well, either that or he's the one who's actually controlling Mecha Sonic from behind the wall. For defeating Mecha Sonic, players will chase Robotnik into the Death Egg robot, resulting in another fight immediately after Mecha Sonic. And this fight is the big bad fight of Sonic 2. On the surface, the Death Egg robot is a fairly simple fight. He'll start by marching towards the player, then he'll leap up and slam back down wherever his reticle is at. If he lands facing Sonic, he'll either launch out his arms to attack the player, which travel most of the screen, or start marching at Sonic again. If he lands with Sonic behind him, he'll either shoot out 4 explosive pods from his backpack the player will need to avoid, or shoot out 2, then march a little bit before jumping again. While this pattern is simple, what truly makes the Death Egg robot difficult is a combination of the insanely large damage hitboxes Robotnik has, as well as, well, the player's own impatience and hubris. There's a version of this fight that's actually incredibly simple, which is the extra cautious version that I'll be fast forwarding myself doing here. The safest bet for hitting the Death Egg robot is in hitting him when he bends down after landing. So if you only attack during this portion and avoid every single other attack, you can defeat the Death Egg robot fairly simply, but the fight takes a little over 3 minutes and a lot of it is waiting around. This is such a boring way to fight the Death Egg robot that I never once thought to do this as a kid, and I never do it as an adult. Instead, I'll always try to find ways to attack him as frequently as possible during his march. But the timing on this is very specific, as the hitboxes from his spiked arms are large, and if the player messes up their timing once or jumps too low, it's an instant death, and you're sent all the way back to Mecha Sonic. Because of that, this is a fight I've never particularly enjoyed, and as a kid, it drove me crazy. I never had too much trouble making it to the Death Egg robot, but the game would come to a quick and frustrating end right here. It's interesting because if you're not patient, this boss is far more difficult than any other challenge in the game, and thanks to having no rings, there's no room for error, meaning there's also not much room to learn from mistakes. And I'm not sure how I feel about that lack of rings or lack of being able to make mistakes, especially in Sonic 2, where up to this point, the game has been fairly simple, so it feels a little out of place. I don't even think there was too much that would have had to be done to make this fight feel a little better. Simply make the window for attacking the Death Egg robot without getting hit by his arms during the walking phase a little larger. While there is this ultra-safe method for defeating the Death Egg robot, It's also pretty boring and not particularly fun. Then there's also the fact that if you choose this method and end up making a mistake, because of how long it takes, it's even more frustrating. You can make the argument that this is a suitable final boss fight because, well, it's the final boss. But I don't think it's a particularly fun final boss, and feel like other Sonic games have done a better job with theirs. Visually, it looks cool and intimidating, but either you're not doing much because you're waiting to be safe, or you're dealing with these incredibly small windows to attack with no room for error. And even then, it's not like this is a reactionary boss fight. Like every fight in the game, Robotnik has one set pattern and then repeats it every time. In Sonic 1's final fight, you're constantly reacting to where is Robotnik going to pop out from, and how to avoid the obstacle of that while also attacking him. How do I avoid the new laser pattern? Here, it's just, man, this hitbox is large. I hope I attack him without messing up, instantly dying and then returning back to Mecha Sonic. I know I'm complaining quite a bit, and I apologize for that. I just feel like, from a visual standpoint, Mecha Sonic and the Death Egg robot were a success, but from a gameplay standpoint, they're a bit of a disappointing cap to Sonic 2. Defeat both Mecha Sonic and the Death Egg robot, and you've done it. The Death Egg robot will explode along with the Death Egg, which makes it pretty shocking Robotnik somehow survives this. Sonic takes a leap of faith out of the Death Egg, because he's that much of a badass, and in a cutscene, Tails, noticing the explosion, hops in his plane to fly up and save Sonic. It's nothing much, but it is a more fun ending than Sonic 1's, which simply saw Sonic running along Green Hill Zone with the animals he saved. If Sonic has gotten all of the Chaos Emeralds, he'll be flying down from the Death Egg, and then alongside Tails before a nice little end card. If Sonic doesn't, the Mad Hedgehog will be spinning down from the sky before Tails catches him on the wing of his plane, and we get a different nice little end card of the two together. I think I actually like this ending more, as it's a little more dramatic with Tails watching the explosion from below, and then going up to rescue his friend. I'm fairly certain that's it for the original Sega Genesis game, with after the credits, it's simply showing Sonic the Hedgehog 2. After the credits, Sonic Origins adds Robotnik juggling the Chaos Emerald Sonic missed with Try Again if players didn't obtain Super Sonic, whereas if Sonic obtained all of the Chaos Emeralds, Robotnik will be hopping in anger with the crashed Death Egg behind him, the text End, and an Easter egg of what's to come with the Death Egg crash landing and eyes looking out from a bush at him, likely meant to be Knuckles. And that's it. Roll the credits. But wait, that's actually not all. I do have some more things to go over, especially if I'm including things from Sonic Origins. Players of the original Sonic always notice that the sound test included an additional song not heard in the game. This, along with rumors and eventually unused assets, helped to spread word of the nearly completed, but not included stage, Hidden Palace Zone. Hidden Palace Zone was in some prototypes of Sonic 2, then a Proto Palace Zone was included in a 2013 remaster of Sonic 2, and then 2022's Sonic Origins saw a fully remastered Hidden Palace Zone. This version of Hidden Palace Zone has a lot of fun ideas to it. There are these bridges Sonic runs across, which bend down with his weight. From a gameplay standpoint, it doesn't mean much, but I think it's a cool visual that was likely impressive for its time. There are plenty of half pipes here players will need to spin dash up, likely showing what the team was thinking about Sonic's moveset early on. Some other fun obstacles are these somewhat 3D spiked smashers, platforms that drop with Sonic's weight, but shoot back up when Sonic jumps, and I especially like this rocket booster that's on a track, where when Sonic grabs it, it will boost Sonic up. It's a rarely used obstacle here, and it's one I would have liked to have seen more of. Outside of bats, this stage has dinosaurs, with Hidden Palace Zone maybe originally meant to take place in the past timeline during the time travel version of Sonic 2. Finally, similar to Aquatic Ruin Zone, at the bottom of the stage is a dangerous purple water area. Overall, I think there's enough here to give Hidden Palace Zone its own identity, but there are a lot of obstacles that are interesting, but not really used to their full potential. That boosting rocket card could have easily been combined with more to make a cool vertical climb, and similarly, these platforms that drop with Sonic's weight could have been used more frequently and in more interesting ways. It's also easy to fly through this stage without engaging in its obstacles too much, which is a bit of a shame. Probably my largest critique though, is that I'm not a fan of how some of these platforms work, where you'll visually see a platform, but it's not actually the wall, and a different portion ends up acting as the wall. I get the idea of it, and that it's supposed to be 3-dimensional so it's not a Sonic's position, but it's a little jarring to me. All of that said, for a hidden randomly included prototype stage, I think this is a fun addition. Had this made it as a full completed stage, I think it needed a little work to really cement its identity and play off of the obstacles it does include a little better, but I like this little taste that we get. Make it through Hidden Palace Zone, and you'll be greeted with a brand new boss fight, Brass Eggman. This very much feels like a Sonic 3 boss battle to me, rather than what we'd been seeing in Sonic 2. Sonic 2's boss battles are frequently simple patterns the player can recognize before landing constant hits on Robotnik. But Sonic 3 oftentimes has battles where players will need to wait for or create openings. Actually, speaking on that, this fight reminds me quite a bit of the Egg Vortex boss battle from Sonic 3. The idea here is that Brass Eggman will use his trumpet to drop explosive spikes from the sky. First he'll drop 4 small spikes into the water below, then raise the water attempting to hit the player. Next, he'll drop 1 much larger spike, which will follow the player around until it finally explodes, creating a water geyser. Brass Eggman is regularly just out of reach for Sonic, so players will need to time out jumping over the large explosive right when they're under Brass Eggman so it explodes and hits him, knocking him down and creating a nice opening for players to lay in attacks. The timing of this has to be pretty precise though, and if players miss with the initial geyser explosion, even if Brass Eggman runs into the created geyser, he won't be knocked down. All of this can make for a fairly difficult battle, as players will have to be pretty precise in when they choose to jump over the large spike. I enjoy the challenge of this, but I do honestly find the waiting period with the smaller spikes to be a little boring. It's not too difficult to avoid, so it really just feels like waiting around before you have another attempt to hit Brass Eggman. Still, it's a nice touch, and cool the team decided to add in this Easter egg. Now that we've discussed all of the stages in Sonic 2, it feels like a good time to talk about the general overall stage design we see in Sonic 2 compared to the first game. I talked a little bit about this in my Sonic 1 video, but something I've always found interesting about Sonic 2, Sonic CD, and Sonic 1 are that who I largely think of as the founding team for what made Sonic the Hedgehog what it was are Yuji Naka, Naoto Oshima, and Hirokazu Yasuhara. That's not to detract from anyone else who worked on the game, and I'm aware Yuji Naka and Naoto Oshima were the onus of the original concept. Naoto Oshima has talked on how they had competing game design philosophies, and would go back and forth adding or removing obstacles to Sonic 1. This process of ideas merging and competing resulted in, I'm sure, several compromises that all benefited the game in the end. But after Sonic 1, Yuji Naka and Hirokazu Yasuhara would go on to work on Sonic 2, while Naoto Oshima would end up working on Sonic CD. To my understanding, even though Sonic 2 released nearly a year before Sonic CD began development prior to Sonic 2's release, and the two teams didn't have communication with each other. So, all of that is to say, it's interesting to see the divergence in gameplay and stage design philosophies between Sonic 2 and Sonic CD, as well as some of the ideas they shared. With Sonic 2, something that seemed to be largely on the minds of the team was multiple routes. Whereas Sonic 1 occasionally had stages with multiple routes, and sometimes with singular routes, the team clearly decided that multiple routes and ways to complete each stage were better. Additionally, as I talked about early into this video, there's an emphasis on moment-to-moment gameplay, with each route having unique concepts and obstacles to create different interesting moments. And even then, they feel well balanced with a mix of beats that are challenging and then simple beats, so the game toes the line between breezy speed sections and challenging platforming. I think that's something Sonic 1 struggled with a little more, with stages that felt overall like obstacle stages or speed stages, rather than Sonic 2 that finds a balance of both within each stage. Something else notable about Sonic 2 is the team seemed very cognizant of giving each stage its own identity in terms of challenges. Beyond enemies, each stage has its own unique obstacles, and oftentimes idea in how the stage layouts are presented. Emerald Hill Zone is a fast-moving open stage, fairly light on obstacles as it's the opening. Chemical Plant Zone is a bit of a maze with giant ramps combined with vertical climbs. Aquatic Ruin Zone is a stay-as-high-as-you-can stage with multiple routes, but an emphasis on players needing to try to stay on the upper route if they can. Casino Night Zone is all about bumpers and bouncing around. Hilltop Zone is the vertical stage with steep cliffs and plenty of climbing and dropping. Mystic Cave Zone is an obstacle-heavy maze. Oil Ocean Zone is, well, similar to Chemical Plant Zone. It's very much about climbing, then dropping down through oil spills, but with a larger emphasis on obstacles. It also has a bit of the stay off the bottom route concept that Aquatic Ruin Zone has. Metropolis Zone is the obstacle-heavy and enemy-heavy course, which really tests players. Sky Chase Zone is a relaxing break. And finally, Wing Fortress Zone is all about platforming, with speed sections in between. Music and visuals aside, it's nice to see so much thought into how the gameplay for each stage should differ, and what should make each stage stand out. One more thing to go over is the two-player versus. This is another one of those things I believe Yuji Naka was insistent on including, and from a technical standpoint, it's incredibly impressive. In the original Sonic 2, players could compete against each other in one of three stages: Emerald Hill Zone, Casino Night Zone, or Mystic Cave Zone. The total score, ring count, and time it took to complete the stage were then compared for one final winner. Additionally, players could compete against each other in the special stages to see who could get the most rings. It's difficult for me to properly judge this, as I didn't have any friends who I'd play competitive Sonic 2 with. I mean, we played multiplayer games, but it was typically games like Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat, and if we did play a platform game together, usually it was taking turns on something like Super Mario World or playing ToeJam and Earl 2 or Ren and Stimpy: Stimpy's Invention. And honestly, I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it was the squished screen, which was a necessity if you wanted players to have their own screen, but honestly can make it pretty difficult to see everything you need to. Or maybe it was because we were more prone to playing cooperative platform games rather than competitive platform games. But I actually think this is a fun idea, and while I didn't get much use out of it, I'm glad it's here for the people who did. While I know Sonic 1 has fans who think it's the best, I'm fairly certain most people will point to one of the sequels as being the superior Sonic game, and Sonic 2 has a widespread fan base, and for good reason. Just about every stage is designed to a degree of excellence, and it's pretty remarkable just how many unique assets and obstacles the team was able to cram into Sonic 2. And to my personal taste, I really do think Sonic 2 outshines Sonic 1. Just about every moment of every stage feels well thought out, and it feels like this was the game where the Sonic team really found its stride in terms of what works and what doesn't work for a Sonic game, which is something I don't hold against Sonic 1. It was the first game, and the amount of good game design decision making that went into it is worth praising, and part of why Sonic has become such a classic. But I can understand that after a year of working on something, and then approaching a sequel, you can really step back and see what you, as a designer, feel worked and resonated versus what didn't. Things like how, in a Sonic game, every stage should have multiple routes. While I don't think you need that in a Mario game or Mega Man game, that's definitely what feels right here in Sonic. Feeling fast and speedy is important to Sonic, but so too are interesting obstacles, and it feels like Sonic 2 is where the team really pieced together how to ensure stages have a good mix of both, really balancing both aspects of Sonic's gameplay. I also think the Spin Dash was an important added tool to Sonic's arsenal that really amped up what the team could do in terms of level design in a positive way. Beyond the gameplay, I think Masato Nakamura's soundtrack is also a step up from the original game, with a slew of fantastic tracks, and even the art in the background and stages feels like an overall upgrade to my personal tastes. While for myself, I think I've pretty squarely landed on Sonic 3 and Knuckles being my favorite of the classic Sonic games, honestly partially because I love Angel Island Zone so much. I'm certain there were times I'd tell you Sonic 2 was my favorite, and I'd go back and forth about which one is the best and why. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, this is my second Sonic video, and if you didn't see the first, I'm pretty happy with how I broke down Sonic's mechanics in Sonic 1, and I hope you'll check it out. I've also been slowly working on making videos like this on the entire classic Mega Man franchise, and just recently completed my episode on Mega Man 8. Finally, as I mentioned, I'm working on a game, ChivalBee. It's a 2D mascot action platform game, and while it's a long way out from being finished, if it looks at all interesting to you, we'd love if you followed our company account, Ophidian Interactive, on either YouTube or social media for cool updates as we have them. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace.